Go ahead, Al.
Click the start broadcast.
Go ahead, Al. It's live.
Good morning and welcome to the Maryland State Data Center annual meeting and workshop hosted by the Maryland Department of Planning. My name is Alfred Sundara. I am the manager of projections and State Data Center at the Maryland Department of Planning. This is the second year in a row we are conducting our annual meeting virtually. Hopefully next year we will be able to do it as an in-person conference. I think we have about 60 people registered for this event today. And our main focus for this online webinar is going to be the 2020 census. We have several folks from the Census Bureau presenting on various topics. I would like to thank them for taking the time to present to us. We have a quick poll question to see what type of organizations the people here in the conference are representing. We'll wait for a few seconds so people can respond to this question.
If you're unable to respond to the poll, you may have to exit from full screen mode. And the question is, what type of organization do you work for? County government or state government or public library system or an MPO or some other organization? We'll give you a couple more seconds here.
Thanks, John. We have significant responses, like we have about 41% from representing state government, 30% from county government, 11% from public libraries, 11% from MPOs, and 7% from other organizations. Thank you, folks. So I would like to mention that we are recording this webinar and we will post it next week on our State Data Center webpage under annual meetings. We will also post today's PowerPoint presentations on the website as well for you to download, and you can also view the recordings at a later time if you need to. I'll also note that we have posted the agenda as a handout on the GoToWebinar control panel. Here is a screenshot of the State Data Center homepage. And you will be able to access the presentations, like I mentioned, by clicking on the annual meetings link shown in the green, highlighted in the green box. So before we begin the presentations, I would like you to orient some of the GoToWebinar features that you will be using today. If you have a question for any of the speakers, you do not have to wait until the end. You can submit a question anytime using the questions tool in the control panel located on the right side of your screen. We will have a question and answer session following each presentation. So now today's webinar features 4 presentations. We have Noemi Mendez. She's a data dissemination specialist with the Census Bureau. She will give us an update on the census data products, including updates on the American Survey data release and the upcoming release of the 2020 census data. We have Michael Haas, Senior Advisor for Data Access and Privacy with the Census Bureau. He will give us a presentation on DAS, or the Disclosure Avoidance System, also known as differential privacy, and basically about how the Census Bureau keeps individuals' data confidential and secure. We have Nicholas Jones, the Director for Race, Ethnicity Research and Outreach at the Census Bureau. He is going to present on the Diversity Index, its calculations and interpretations. He is going to present on this topic along with Eric Jensen, a Senior Technical Expert for Demographic Analysis with the Census Bureau. And We also have Secretary McCord of the Department of Planning saying a few words later today around 11 a.m. And we have Krishna Quindi. He's a socioeconomic data analyst with the State Data Center. He will give an overview of the State Data Center's website. Finally, I'll talk a little about some of the upcoming census programs. So with that said, we will get started with the first presentation from Noemi Mendes. I will stop sharing my screen and Noemi can start her presentation. Welcome, Noemi.
Good morning. Let me just get my presentation up and running, and then I'll make sure everybody can see my screen. Okay.
We don't have your screen shared yet, Noemi.
It happens. Anyway, I'll start with introducing myself. So my name is Noemi Mendez. I'm with the U.S. Census Bureau. I'm a data dissemination specialist. Let's see, let's go show my screen. Let me know if you guys can see what I'm seeing.
I'm seeing your PowerPoint, but at this point, it's not
okay.
in full mode.
Yeah, I'm clicking on slideshow. There's a delay. Now can you see it?
Proceed, you're good.
Okay, thank you. Again, so my name is Noemi Mendez. I'm a data dissemination specialist with the Census Bureau, and this is my 18th year at the Bureau. I have been a geographer, a partnership and data specialist, and now a DDS. But in addition to my work with the Bureau, I teach census data and visualization courses at Hopkins and Temple, and I attended the geography programs at Syracuse and CUNY Hunter College. So this is my agenda for this morning. I'll talk a little bit about the 2020 redistricting data, give you some ACS updates, mention our data equity resources hub, and also go over our COVID-19 Data Hub. So for those of us who we're all pretty seasoned census data users, but just a reminder about the decennial census data that we release, just to make sure everyone knows that the data that we get from census to census varies depending on the questions that were asked during that decennial. But the topics that we've been covering for the past several years are information on age, sex, race, Hispanic origin, and then housing tenure. So for the data that's available from the 2020 census, which we call redistricting data from the Public Law 94-171, there's data on occupancy status for housing. So housing is an H table, H1. Our population tables are race, Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race, P2. Race for the population 18 years and older, P3. Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race for the population 18 years and older, P4. Group quotas population by major group quota status. So those are the tables that are released from this data. For those of you, there's information there. It's not as varied or rich as the American Community Survey data, but for those of you who are looking for the 2020 census data, it's been released last month to our data.census.gov data dissemination tool. So basically, the tool is very easy to use. For instance, I put in our advanced search bar, 2020 census data, and I chose Baltimore City. You can add, whatever geography you're looking at. So it's going to filter out the 2020 public law data. So you'll have your occupancy status. This is just a screenshot of the tool, race, Hispanic origin, et cetera, and then you just click on the title. So for instance, this is the group quarters population by major group quarters type. For those of you who are not familiar, group quarters are anything where there's an overseer over the the facilities. So there's institutionalized populations, and then you have your non-institutionalized, such as your dormitory housing, your military quarters, and then other facilities. So this is the breakdown according to the 2020 census for Baltimore City. And then you can also map these geographies using our tool. So for instance, I chose census tract for the decennial census, and I chose population of one race, Black or African American, and it tells you your product. So you can now map these geographies if you wanted to. And then we have our 2020 Census Demographic Data Viewer, which is a story map in conjunction with Esri. And this is a nice tool because it renders very quickly. It's on the cloud. It's using, story maps, which have been around for a long time. So you can just click on the individual tabs. For instance, if I wanted to look at Hispanic origin data for 2020 for the state of Maryland, you do need to zoom in. So you hit your tab, you zoom in, and then it gives you two tabs. It gives you the Hispanic or Latino, and then the not Hispanic or Latino. So it gives you information, and then it breaks down. It tells you what each color means. So it's very simple, very, very neat tool. Okay, so I'm going to switch a little bit to the ACS updates. So I just kind of want to read some messaging. So due to the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, the Census Bureau is changing the 2020 ACS release schedule. So instead of providing the standard one-year data products, the census will release a series of experimental estimates from the one-year data no later than November 30th. This will include a limited number of data tables for the nation, states, and the District of Columbia. The 2020 ACS one-year experimental estimates will be posted on the ACS experimental data webpage. They will not be available on data.census.gov. So if you go there and you can't find it at the end of November, it's because it's on a special page created just for the data. So if you're interested in the list of the table IDs and table titles, you go to the experimental page and it has a list of the release. And then the 2016 to 2020 ACS 5-year products are slated to be released by the end of the year. Okay. So I just want to bring into everyone's attention, we have a lot of data and information on data equity resources. So, how different segments of the population are making gains or are impacted by the pandemic or the recent economic recession. So the Census Bureau surveys and programs have long measured equity gaps across demographic groups. Publicly available data and tools can help identify vulnerable and underserved communities. The Census Bureau is committed to raising awareness about data, tools, and resources available to help federal, state, local governments, and community groups identify underserved communities and equitably distributed resources. So one of the big things that recently came out is the Income and Poverty Report. So the Income and Poverty Report reports that the official poverty rate in 2020 was 11.4%, up 1 percentage point from the 10.5% in 2019. So this is the first increase in poverty after 5 consecutive annual declines. Also, the report says that in 2020, there were 37.2 million people in poverty, approximately 3.3 million more than in 2019. That the real median household income decreased by 2.9% to $67,521 between 2019 and 2020. Also, between 2019 and 2020, the total number of people with earnings decreased by about 3 million. The number of those who worked full-time year-round decreased by 13.7 million. And then finally, the real median earnings of all workers decreased 1.2%, while the real median earnings of those who worked full-time year-round increased 6.9% between 2019 and 2020. If you go to the census.gov homepage and you scroll down a little bit to reports, you can access the report there. You can click on the link and it'll take you to the report, and it's a PDF report, I believe. And also we have a lot of information on gender and pay gap. This is a screenshot from one of our America Counts articles. If you haven't seen these, they're under our library, where weekly the US Census Bureau releases data and a story talking about the data and what the data means. So we had an income and poverty report for the US in 2020. So there was a lot of information. There's this information about gender and pay gap. That was something that hit the news. So if you want to kind of keep up to date with what how the data is getting released and how people will use it, I suggest you can hit our news story page. Also, just really quickly, I want to show you this tool called the 2019 Community Resilience Estimates. So this is another tool that's used for data equity, looking at counties, and this is the information for Maryland, and it looks at things such as, people with disability, people whether or not they have health insurance, age, whether or not they have vehicle access or broadband. And if you read more about the program, it kind of tells you if there's an emergency of some sort or another pandemic, what are the communities that are most vulnerable? So it gauges their information, and then it tells us how this information can be used to help those communities that might be most at risk. And then finally, our COVID-19 Data Hub. This came out, when the pandemic was very active, and it's still active, but kind of at the beginning of it. And we had these COVID-19 impact planning reports looking at ACS data and looking at, again, those communities that would be most impacted. And you can get the data by state and then by county. On the left is a screenshot of what the homepage looks like. So from there, you can get the racial equity data tools. You can get our COVID-19 data, and lots of other tools that are available on there. And then we would like to, we've been partnering with other agencies and other organizations to kind of make these tools to make our data more accessible and more understood in the time that we're going through right now. So that's basically what I have with me. If we have some time, I can do a live demo of some of the tools, but this is the way to contact me, my email address and phone number. But one of the other things I'd like to promote is our Census Ask Data phone number and email address. So if you have a question about our data, how to access the data, or you would like to request a training from a data dissemination specialist, you can call our phone number, or you can send an email. And then also the one thing that we're really promoting is our Census Academy. If you're not familiar with it, it's an online data training hub where we have webinars that we do. We record them and put this on our site. We're working with subject matter experts to create courses for all different skill levels that are put on here. One of the other things I do is I work with our subject matter experts, and we're putting together a course on using Python to create maps and charts with our API. So that should be coming out soon. So if you want to keep abreast of what's going on with Census Academy, you can go to our website and you can subscribe to our newsletter. And like everything that we do, it's no cost. All the information is on there. So if you're looking for how do I use the redistricting data, we have these very short they're videos, 3 or 4 minutes, created by our staff to show you how to maneuver their website and get our data. Okay, so that's my presentation. Do we have time for questions or a demonstration?
Hey, Noemi, could you please go back into full screen mode and go back to your second to last slide? Leave that up while Al asks you questions. It would just be helpful.
Sure.
All right, thank you, Noemi. We have a couple of questions here. I'm going to read them out to Noemi, so see if you can answer them. So we have a question from Kirk Eby. He's asking, is the Census Bureau making the source GIS data or map service available for the 2020 redistricting data web map that was shown?
I'd have to check. I haven't seen anything on our website, but I can, if I can get the person's contact information, I can contact Geo and see what their plans are.
Okay, I have a couple of, I have this other question from the Department of Health. This is the Maryland Department of Health. They're asking, when will the Census Bureau release the single year of age data for the 2020 census?
I don't think it is going to be released. I can double check. As far as I know, they've told my staff that these are the tables that are released. I can see, I know they did that for 2010, I believe.
Right.
Single age date. Yeah, right. I'm writing this down to follow up.
Okay, I have a question from Manisha Tiwari. She's asking, are there any webinars on using R for accessing census data?
We have a course. It is a couple years old, but if you go on the Census Academy, go to courses, I believe there's it's an R course with using census data, so you can check there.
Okay. All right, thanks. We can do a quick search on the census courses, and then you will be able to find that, I guess, right?
Yes, just go into Census Academy, and there's a button for courses.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
So we have a couple of other questions. The 1 year ACS was not released this year. The question is, was this because of low response rate?
I think it's a combination of the responses and they were just worried about, because they feel like the quality of the data is not up to what the Census Bureau standards are, but they did want to release something to test to see about the quality of the data. That's why they're coming out with that kind of alternate release.
Okay, there are a couple of follow-up questions with this, saying that since the Census Bureau is going to release experimental data, was this the first time that experimental data were used for the ACS or any census data program? Is this the first time?
I can't speak beyond what I've used my time at data dissemination, which is about 8 years. I don't remember any, but maybe some of the other panelists on today's meeting can speak more to that.
All right. Okay. And this is basically the follow-up again. Do you anticipate this happening more frequently in the future? I guess so. I mean, like releasing of the experimental data for ACS.
Can you repeat it, because you cut off a little bit? I'm sorry.
So the question is basically, do you anticipate this type of experimental data release happening more frequently in the future?
Oh, I'm sorry. I can't speak to that. That would be something for the ACS division.
Okay. All right. We have a question from Pamela Zorich. She's asking, when will the remainder of the 2020 census data be released?
Like I said, as far as I know, what's out there was what's out there now. I haven't heard that there is going to be a second release, but I can find out from the decennial division.
Okay. And okay, thanks, Noemi. I don't see any other questions. So, Noemi, thank you for your presentation and providing the information on the census updates.
Absolutely.
We will go on to the next item on the agenda. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the updates that happened at the State Data Center. And after I'm done, Krishna is going to share his screen and give us an overview of some of the data products we have on the State Data Center website. So since the last year, it was pretty busy, and it was a little different with working from home for the most part with the pandemic, and probably everybody is used to working from home now. But the most important thing was happening last year, basically the census counts. So the State Data Center was tasked to provide data support to our outreach folks, our outreach team, and also provide data assistance to the Maryland Complete Count Committee. And with our fine folks from our IT section, we were able to develop a dashboard that showed potential low response areas using some techniques that Krishna developed. Basically, he looked at some of the variables from the planning database and identified some key variables that have an impact on response rates. So we identified those key variables on a dashboard with the help from our IT folks, and this helped the complete count committee to focus their outreach efforts to those specific areas. So, one good thing that came out of the whole census outreach and our support is like Maryland's response rate increased from what it was back in 2010. Response rate in the sense the self-response rate is what I'm talking about. We were in the top 10 of all states, which was something the administration was aiming for, and we were very pleased with that result. So the other thing I wanted to quickly mention is kind of like how we came or overcame some of the difficulties we had with the whole pandemic and the closure and not working from home. One of the tasks we are mandated to do by Maryland statute is school projections. We have to do them every year. And this year's school projections, which was based on 2020 data, was a little challenging. Actually, that would be a little understatement, because like with the whole schooling from home, I guess like not a lot of students were showing up in the public school systems. And when we were looking at the attendance which we use for each year to do our projections are based on a grade succession ratio. So we look at the last year's projections, and using some sort of a succession ratio, we project into the future. As you all know, with the impact of the pandemic, the school enrollments were much lower, like about 10% lower than what they were before in 2019. So, so that was a challenging thing. Thankfully, with the help of our Planning Data Services Director, Kanishk Sharma, he formed a partnership with Massive Data Institute of Georgetown University, and they helped us research techniques to do projections by adjusting the data for 2020. So we basically adjusted the data using a regression technique, using data from the last 4 or 5 years of enrollments, and came up with this partnership. Is probably going to continue into the future with Georgetown University as we do some research and projections for other topics as well. So that's really helpful. And another topic I would like to quickly mention is like we at the State Data Center are helping with the building permits information. And I'd like to thank Chuck Boyd, our Director for Planning Coordination. He's undertaking this massive project of coordinating with all the local governments in Maryland and asking them to share their data to set up a statewide building permit system. And I believe the system is going to be really helpful for us, because when we were looking at the school projections using grade succession ratio, that wasn't really feasible with the methodology we were using. It would have been helpful to supplement what we had with building permits data for residential permits, at least, to see where developments was going in. That would have been helpful. So hopefully in the next year also, maybe in the next couple of years, we might have a system in place that would be helpful. And this building permits data is something we share. I believe that not we right now, but the census, the local government shares with the Census Bureau, which the Census Bureau releases every month for the state and the county level geographies. And for municipalities or counties that do not have the capability, we would probably undertake that and submit the data to the Census Bureau for building permits. And also we would be using this building permits data for our population projections, which are, again, we are mandated by Maryland statute to do them once every 3 years at least. And we use a cohort component method, but again, like the building permits data would help us check some of our projections, all the projections we are doing. And finally, we also do jobs projections, but it would be a little useful in terms of when we have the commercial use developments by various users, we can probably look at that and see what types of jobs are going to be available. And also, the building permits data is going to have other uses, especially like for when we were doing the 2020 census support before the census counts began. We were tasked to do the LUCA program, or the local update of census addresses. We have fairly good data, which is put together by our mappings division from SDAT, SDAT being the State Department of Assessments and Taxations. We use their data, but the data we get from them is usually good to identify a single family home. But when we have multi-family units, the assessments department isn't really keen on finding out how many units are there. They're only interested in the assessments of the property. So the building permits data would be helpful really in terms of having accurate addresses for the census program, so everybody in Maryland is counted. And the last thing I want to mention is, like with the census count review program, where we are counting how many housing units are in each block, this information would have been really helpful. And we had quite a few corrections and suggestions that we offered as part of the State Data Center to the Census Bureau for the 2020 census. So these are all the programs that we would help. And again, like I said, like we are undertaking several big projects, coordinating some other efforts with other folks to see we have good data for Maryland and use it in our projections and analysis. And before I pass it on to Krishna, Noemi, I see one other question that came your way. Would you be able to answer this if you still have control? So
Sure.
Pamela Zorik is basically asking, so only public law, no SF1 or SF3 releases for 2020 so far?
So far, I quickly looked on our webpage, and there was some talk that that looks like they're gonna release them, but there hasn't. I can't find anything as far as a release date.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. And I heard.
I can say a little bit about that if
sure.
This is Nicholas Jones from the Census Bureau. So Michael Halls in his presentation later this morning is going to talk about the topic of differential privacy. And that's also something that's related to the work that's being done to help produce those statistics, formerly known as Summary File 1 and 2. But I think that Michael will be able to address some of that in his presentation. Work is underway and engagement and outreach on the future data products, which include things like the statistics on sex by age and also the tenure data and other family and household statistics. But I think that will be a good topic for Michael's presentation.
All right, thank you, Nicholas. Thank you, Noemi, for answering that. And I did hear too, like from the State Data Center Network liaison, that they might release this data early next year, maybe summer at the most of next year. But I don't know. We still have to wait and see for the official announcement, I guess. All right. With that said, let's transition over to let's transition over to Krishna to give us an overview of the State Data Center website and the data we have there.
Hello, I'm Krishna Okundi with the State Data Center. And as you're seeing on the screen, this is our web page. For those of you who have been here before, you will notice that the template or the look has changed from previous years. This is our landing page, and as in previous years, the header line here shows you our the primary tabs. But as you scroll down, you'll notice that this area has changed considerably. What we have now are these banners. So anytime we have a new report that we published, or data, or a new data set that's been released, you'll find it on our banner here. And you can click on the banner to go to that data set or to that report. Now we have in the center of the page the information you've seen before, such as our quick links, our popular links, and also information about the about the State Data Center. After this meeting is concluded, for those of you searching for the PowerPoint or for the video, it'll be, you can find it under About Us and click on the annual meetings link. We also have online services and external links to the primary federal statistical agencies. So in addition to Maryland.gov, we have links to the U.S. Census Bureau, the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and the U.S. Internal Revenue Service. These agencies also serve as the primary sources for the data we present on our website. Now, if we go back up, so if you click on Census Data tab, so the Data tab obviously has been refreshed to show the most recent 2020 data. As of now, we have the Census 2020 Maryland State Profile, which links to the Census Bureau. And then, of course, we have the 2020 Census PL 94-171 data. This is the redistricting data. And the other releases from the Census Bureau this year, the apportionment data and the resident population data. On the right-hand content, you'll see we also have something staff put together, which is the 2020 Census Population Housing Unit Summary. We also have a comparison of 2020 and 2010 census population by jurisdiction. And on the left-hand content, again, we have, you can link back to the historical censuses, the Census 2010, the Census 2000, and of course, historical census data going back to 1980 and 1970. We also have external links to the Board of Elections and to the Maryland General Assembly. I'm going to click on the 2020 Census PL 94-171 data. The reason I keep saying PL 94-171 data as opposed to redistricting data is, as some of you may know, in the state of Maryland, as in a growing number of states, the Census PL 94-171 data does not include the information on prisoners prior to their incarceration. So in the state of Maryland, that is a requirement that we include data on prisoners who had, prior to incarceration, a Maryland residence. So when we get to this page, we have this qualifier, as I mentioned, about the distinction between the census data, the census redistricting data, and Maryland's redistricting data as specified in the statute 2-2A-01. What we show on this page is, again, on this page, we do have a link to the adjusted redistricting data for those of you following the redistricting process. I mean, if those, you will be aware of that page, which is on the, which you can link to from the Maryland Department of Planning page. But I want to focus here on the Census 2020 PL 94-171 data. So this is the actual raw data that we got from the Census Bureau that we downloaded from the census site. So you can actually get the P1 and P2, the tables P1 and P2 for these geographies. We have population 18 years and over. We have the table numbers there, the group quarters data. But also what's important here is you can actually download the Census 2020 geographies from this page. So if you click on the shape file, that's basically a zip file that has all the geographies, you know, down to the block level. I do want to take a moment to show you the ACS tab. Yep. And right now, the latest data we have is the 2019 ACS, 1-year ACS. The 5-year ACS, the latest we have now is the 2015 to 2019. And as Noemi mentioned, the 2016 to 2020 5-year ACS should be released in December. And when it is, we will post it here. In addition to the census data and the information we post on our website, again, we customize all the data for Maryland, its jurisdictions, and its municipalities. On the left-hand content, we do have links to other data sets. The planning database, which is, Al had mentioned early on about the low response scores, and you know, that analysis that the Census Bureau had done and that we looked at when we were doing our review. So that data set is available in the planning database. We have a link to data.census.gov. For those of you who are familiar and have used them, we have a link to IPMS, the NHGIS. Also a link to the CTPP, the Census Transportation Planning Package. And also a link to the UExplore, which is a data set, not just a data set, but a data access portal from the University of Missouri. I also want to I do want to show you our estimates tab. So here we have, you know, the most recent population estimates from the Census Bureau. The 2020 estimates, we have those available here. And what's interesting for comparison purposes is that the 2020 estimate is nowhere close to the actual 2020 census figure. But I'm sure that when the next census estimates are released, you know, it's a completely new, the base will change, I assume, and there'll be a new data set there. In addition, we have the median household income for Maryland's jurisdictions and places. We updated that in June of this year. Poverty rates. The Consolidated Federal Funds Report, as many of you know, ended in 2010. But we do have plans to provide a new data set that doesn't really look at the federal funds per se, but rather federal spending by state. And we hope to bring that that data set, make that data set available on our website in the next year or so. The other thing that we do that we can access from here is the residential sales, the building permits, and also the residential parcel in and out of priority funding area data. So the residential sales data, actually, we have updated that to 2020. And if you click there, you can see we do have the methodology. You can, again, it is the drop down under by county is for each year, for each vintage, the same for the zip codes and the residential sales data summary. So the most recent is 2020, and we will be updating this on a regular basis for those of you who are looking for residential sales data. Now the data, the raw data actually comes, as I believe Al mentioned, through SDAT and through the massaging from our mapping team. As Al mentioned, the projections. Our projections primarily look at the population projections, which are currently to 2045, and they will be updated to 2050 as we change the base to 2020. We have the school enrollment projection, so if you click on this link, you'll get the most recent school enrollment, the public school enrollment projections. And so you can click on the report by clicking on this link, and we also have available the individual tables that you can look at both in Excel format and in PDF. We also have charts and detailed spreadsheets for you to look at. Again, this is the most recent set of projections we have from 2021 to 2030. The projections report also includes historical data going back. And also on the left-hand content, we do have a link to the methodology for population household projections. Underneath, we have links to the metropolitan planning organizations, the Baltimore Metropolitan Council, BMC, the Washington Council of Governments, MCOG, and also the Wilmington Area Planning Council. As Al mentioned before, unlike what many jurisdictions do in terms of their projections, and also the way the metropolitan councils do them, when we do our projections, we rely on a model called the cohort component model, which basically looks at birth, death, and migration data. And as Al mentioned, we use a methodology to project that information to the future. I want to spend the next few minutes looking at our economic and ag census tab. And we actually have the latest 2017 census data from the latest census of agriculture. So we have information on farm. Again, everything is specific to the state of Maryland, its jurisdictions. As you know, we have not included on the left-hand content, but we will be shortly. We will include a link to the National Agricultural Statistics Service, from which a lot of this data is coming from. In addition to the Census of Agriculture, we also have links to the economic census going back to 1997. The 2017 economic census, we provide data again for the state of Maryland and in some cases for the jurisdictions for these two-digit industries, two-digit NAICS industries. In some instances, we do have three-digit NAICS code available, but primarily for these industries. And as you will notice, for the 2017 economic census, we do not have a live link for manufacturing, as that was not made available for the state of Maryland. And I think on the going back to the ACS page, I did go through that very quickly. I did want to share that, as you scroll down, in addition to the ACS, we do have the local employment household dynamics, the LEHD. The most recent we have right now is 2018. We expect to be releasing the 2021 when it becomes available. So we will try to release this on a 3-year turnaround, I believe. So basically, it's looking at commuting flows for Maryland's jurisdictions. One of the things we did not include here, but we will be including on the left-hand content, are links to the Census Bureau, the program between the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics on the local employment household dynamics, the LEHD program, which includes things like the quarterly workforce indicators, the on the map tool, as well as the loads data, which the LEHD we showed down here is primarily based on. And I think that's oh, I did want to show you that you can go back and link to the Maryland Department of Planning from here. And so if you click on MDP, you get to the main Department of Planning page. And if you scroll down, you can also link, for those of you who already done that, you're familiar with this, you can link to the Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission page and to the data we have that we are displaying for them on what's happening with redistricting, the plans that have come through, etc. And I think that's all I wanted to share. Thank you.
Thank you, Krishna. That was really great. I have a couple of comments I would like to read out. Pam's audit says, great update to the website layout and assorted data is easy to find. Appreciate the hard work behind the revisions. And Beth is asking, what is the CTPP?
Yes, so I think actually the Maryland, the metropolitan planning organizations who are here today can better answer that. But basically, it was data specifically for transportation planning. It's a transportation planning package that can be used again if you're looking at commuting patterns. So basically, we showed data on our website from the LEHD. The CTPP also shows similar data, but using a different methodology, I believe. And I believe they are not, the data is not available as frequently as the LEHD, and I'm not sure about that. I'll leave that to Al and the MPOs to answer that question, because I do include that because we include data on our website on the left-hand content. Not only that supplements some of the data we show on our web pages, but also data in response to requests we have received. So if someone has asked a question about, transportation, commuting patterns, commuting times, well, in addition to LEHD, in addition to these other sources we have from the ACS, there is another source you might want if you want to drill down more, such as the CTPP. So it's I believe it's called the Census Transportation Planning Package, but I'll leave that to the experts to answer.
All right. Thanks, Krishna. You're right. The CTPP data, I don't think, is being released after the ACS has been put in place. And I used to work for an MPO before, so I kind of have an idea. And they used to release data. The traffic analysis zones are usually referred to as the TAZs, which would be, like you mentioned, helpful to identify commuting patterns and travel times and whatnot between various geographies. That would be helpful in determining the roadway issues or where improvements need to happen. So those are the things. And Greg actually posted a link. Greg Goodwin from MWCOG posted a link to the CTPP transportation.org website. And I'll share that with everybody. And there are a couple of questions I might ask you to answer one, and I'll take one. So how does the Census Data Center, how does the data center work with Maryland's MPOs to prepare regional projections? Since I work primarily on projections, I probably will be able to answer this. So the way we work is like the regional organizations here, like the Baltimore Metropolitan Council and MWCOG, the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, have a corporate forecasting work group. We folks from the state data center participate in their CFGs, and the CFGs function for their particular regions. So the individual jurisdictions within them provide projections to the regional partners or the MPOs, and we get to review them and provide feedback to the local jurisdictions before they are adopted officially by the respective MPOs to be used in their transportation plans. So what we do is like since we provide feedback to the jurisdictions, we are comfortable in most cases using their projections as a control total for our population projections when we break out the population based on age, race, and gender for the jurisdictions. So it's like a partnership with them. We work with them in developing the projections, and we provide feedback. So that's how it works. We attend their meetings almost monthly or bi-monthly, whatever the schedule may be. So that's how we work. And there's another question here. This is probably for you, Krishna. Does the data center provide technical support to local governments that are preparing comprehensive plan updates to help interpret the census data?
Yes, we do. As many of you probably know, the Maryland Department of Planning, through the Planning Coordination, Planning Services divisions, they get comments from the different units within the Department of Planning, and one of the units that provides comments is the State Data Center. We review plans that are submitted to us that are for review by many of you probably know Joe Griffiths. So Joe Griffiths' team provides us a plan to review. We review those specifically looking at the use of census data, also looking at any projections that have been used in those plans, and we review those with an attention to that. And when we find inconsistencies, or if we find inconsistencies in an interpretation, or we find that the data that is being used is not current, we will comment on that. And we will also look at projections. Now, for jurisdictions, counties, we always urge counties to use the projections we produce for the population, but they don't have to. What we do, however, is when we review that section, one of the questions we ask and we look for is, well, what was the methodology? Is there a link to the methodology? Is there a footnote, something that tells us this is how it was done? When it comes to municipalities that develop projections, as many of you know, the State Data Center, the Planning Department, does not publish its municipal projections. And there are reasons for that, which I don't want to go into because I don't want to take too much of my time. But what we do is we review the type of projections that a municipality has prepared in its comprehensive plan. And in some cases, or in most cases, we will work with that municipality to improve its projections, or simply comment on them and hope those comments may be of some help. Or we can work with them to produce those projections. I hope that answers your question.
Fairly good enough, comprehensive. Thank you. I have a couple of, I have a comment and one more question before we move on to the next presenter. Sean Kimberly says the most recent CTPP data is from 2012 to 2016. And I have a question here from Chuck Boyd. He's asking, I noticed that there was a sizable portion of the attendees from library affiliates. Do they provide the data center information on the type of information requested through the libraries? Krishna, do you have a response to this? Or if not, I can see how we provide information back to the libraries.
I will let you answer that, Al. I think you're in a better position.
So most often, like if there is a specific data request that comes from the library, we handle it as the request comes in. But for the most part, the most commonly used data that's requested from the libraries is posted on the website. We typically direct them, if they're not familiar with, to where on the website we can find the data. Say, for example, if we get a request for the poverty data for a particular geography in Maryland, we have the data posted on a couple of different locations on the on our website. Like we have our SAPI information at the county level, and we also have the ACS data at the smaller geography levels. Based on the type of request we get, we will point to the user where exactly to find that. And in most cases, like we have also volunteered to do a presentation for the libraries if they are not familiar with what we do or what data we have. So we constantly work with them and provide them the information they need. So I think that's the last question we have, and we will move on to our next topic. Thank you, Krishna, for taking the time to go over our website. And we will go to our next presenter, Michael Haas, to talk about disclosure avoidance system.
Great, thank you, Al. And can you just confirm that you can see my screen and that you can hear me?
Yes, I can see your screen. It's not in full screen yet.
I'm working on putting it into full screen. There we go.
Yep, good.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having me. I am excited to be able to join you virtually this year to discuss the Census Bureau's new confidentiality protections for the 2020 census. Before I start, I just want to acknowledge the contributions of my colleagues here at the Census Bureau and our many external stakeholders who have contributed to the information that's included here. And also to give the disclaimer that any opinions and viewpoints expressed today are entirely my own and are not the opinions or viewpoints of the U.S. Census Bureau. So the U.S. Census Bureau takes great care to safeguard the privacy of our respondents and the confidentiality of our respondents' data. This is a legal obligation for us under Title 13, Sections 8 and 9, which prohibit us from releasing any information that could be used to re-identify our respondents or the information from their census responses. But more importantly, this commitment to data stewardship is necessary in order for us to continue collecting quality data about the country. The American public trusts us to protect their information, and we need to be able to maintain that trust if we're going to be able to continue collecting accurate information about the nation's people and economy. So in order for us to have quality data in the first place, we have to make sure that we're properly safeguarding and protecting those data. Throughout its history, the Census Bureau has been at the forefront of the research, design, and implementation of a whole suite of statistical methods that can be used to safeguard respondent data in the information that we publish. And over the decades, as the threats to privacy protection have increased, and as the detail and granularity of the data that we're publishing increased, we've had to update our methods in order to keep pace with the growing risk of disclosure of personal information in our official publications. Our adoption of differential privacy, which is the framework underlying our new confidentiality protections for the 2020 census, is merely the latest in what has been a long history of continuous innovation in this space. So the real challenge that we face is that de-identification of data, like complete de-identification of data for public release, is impossible. We know mathematically that anytime you're going to release any statistic that's calculated from a confidential data source like the census, releasing those statistics is going to reveal or leak a tiny amount of confidential information in the process. So if you release too many statistics at too high a degree of accuracy, then eventually you'll have revealed all of the underlying confidential data in the process. And the challenge that we face is made more pressing and worrisome by two parallel trends that have occurred over the last several years: more data and faster computers. There has been a massive proliferation in third-party data, commercial data, financial data, social media information, etc., that an attacker could use to try to pick out specific individuals in the data that the Census Bureau publishes. And in parallel with this proliferation of third-party data, computers have gotten significantly more powerful. The kind of new machine learning algorithms that are easily available to your average hacker can quite easily leverage all of that rich third-party data in an attempt to pick out specific individuals in the data that we publish. And these parallel trends are not abstract. These are real concrete concerns that we have to be able to protect against. So what is it that we're really trying to protect against? At its core, we're trying to protect against re-identification. And this occurs when data that we publish, quasi-de-identified confidential data that doesn't have like names or addresses on it, but that has other characteristics about those individuals. Re-identification occurs when you're able to take those published confidential data and link them to third-party data sources that do have names or other identifiers. So an example here, you could take published confidential data from the census and link it to voter registration lists or commercially available data for those same areas. And then you can attach Jane, Joe, and John's names to their confidential records in the published data. Now, many disclosure avoidance approaches have just focused on kind of like thorough methods for protecting against re-identification of microdata when you're releasing statistical data products that are individual level data sets. And traditionally, agencies have paid less attention to the privacy protections used for their aggregate data releases. But what we've realized recently is that it is actually possible to take aggregate tabular data releases and reconstruct the individual level records that produced those tabular results. And you can think of this reconstruction kind of as like a giant game of Sudoku, if you're familiar with Sudoku. With a Sudoku puzzle, if you have enough numbers pre-populated into the grid, well, then eventually there's one and only one unique solution to the puzzle. Well, the same holds true with aggregate tabular data. If you release enough data tables that are disaggregated in enough different ways, well, then eventually there's going to be one and only one set of individual level records that could have yielded all of those aggregate results. And computers can do the solving for this individual level data from aggregate summaries with relative ease. So with the understanding that it's now possible to reconstruct those individual level data from aggregate tabular releases, the Census Bureau wanted to conduct a simulated attack to see if it was possible to reconstruct individual level census responses from the aggregate data that we typically release. Now, to give you an idea, the 2010 census collected a handful of attributes about the age, sex, race, ethnicity, and relationship status for the 309 million people in the US that were enumerated for the 2010 census. That gave us about 1.9 billion confidential data points that we had to protect. But the 2010 census data products included over 150 billion different statistics calculated from those 1.9 billion confidential data points. So with the understanding that every one of those statistics is leaking a tiny bit of confidential information, we wanted to see if those 150 billion statistics were sufficient to reconstruct the 1.9 billion confidential data points from the census, essentially to reconstruct the individual level records for the people enumerated in the 2010 census. So we conducted our own internal simulated attack to evaluate this vulnerability. And unfortunately, the results were rather eye-opening. We were able to accurately reconstruct records for every block in the 2010 census. And we were able to accurately reconstruct individual level records, including block, sex, age in years, plus or minus 1 year, race and ethnicity for 71% of the US population. It's about 219 million people. And then linking those reconstructed individual level records to commercially available data from the time period, and then evaluating whether we had successfully linked to the right people, we actually found that we had accurately re-identified on all variables for 52 million people. That's 17% of the US population. Those reconstructed individual level records were a very close approximation of the enumerated confidential 2010 census data, and this was very concerning. So with the understanding that the threats to privacy protection have been increasing, we realized that our traditional approaches to protecting privacy in our published data, particularly in our published tabular data, were growing increasingly insufficient. So the Census Bureau decided that we had to modernize our approach to confidentiality protection for the 2020 census. So now to understand a little bit about what the new process for protecting confidentiality in the 2020 census data products, it's helpful to understand a little bit about how disclosure avoidance, these statistical safeguards that we use, work in general. So all disclosure avoidance methods, whether differential privacy, like our new methodology, or swapping and suppression methodologies like we've used for past censuses, all disclosure avoidance methods seek to make re-identification of specific individuals more difficult by doing one or more of three basic things. They seek to either reduce the precision of the data that you're publishing, they can seek to remove vulnerable records from the data that you're going to tabulate and publish, or they can seek to introduce uncertainty or noise into the data. And commonly used traditional approaches for this include things like complementary suppression routines, rounding your published values, recoding your extreme values at the top or bottom end of the distribution, sampling from a larger population, swapping records like we used for the 2000 and 2010 censuses, or other forms of noise injection. Now, the challenge with kind of these approaches, and particularly traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance, is that they impose a fundamental trade-off between the degree of privacy protection on the one hand and the accuracy of the data on the other. This isn't a side effect of the statistical safeguard, it's actually how they work. In order to protect privacy, you need to diminish the accuracy or the availability of the data. You can't get around that. And how you frame that balance, how you decide where on that spectrum to be, is determined by the parameters of your method's implementation. It could be your record swapping rates, your noise injection parameters, your cell suppression thresholds, and so on. Those are what determine that balance between privacy protection on the one hand and data accuracy or availability on the other.
Hi, Michael.
Yes?
Sorry to interrupt. I'm sorry, we are losing your audio, fading in and out.
Let me move my microphone a little bit and see if that helps. Is that any better?
Yeah, this is better. Like, yeah, I could hear you clearly now, but like maybe in between in the previous slide, you broke off for a few seconds. So
Okay, do you want me to repeat the last slide?
Yeah, that would be helpful. And if you're closer to the mic, that's helpful too. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'm holding the mic right in front of my mouth now, so hopefully that will help. So what I was saying was that all disclosure avoidance methods impose this fundamental trade-off between the strength of your privacy protection on the one hand and the accuracy or the availability of your data on the other. And this is a fundamental consequence of disclosure avoidance. It's how they work.
Michael, I'm sorry, that's not helping. Could you please go to your audio tab and select the radial bubble for phone call, and then follow those instructions. There's something probably in your connection that's dropping. Please stand by. He is reconnecting with a phone line, everyone.
Hi, this is Michael calling in from my phone. Can you hear me better now?
Thank you. Yes, yes. Proceed. Okay.
Okay.
We're sorry for the technical difficulty.
Yeah, apologies for that. Must be having bandwidth issues in my neighborhood. So as I was saying, all statistical techniques that you can use to protect privacy impose this fundamental trade-off between the degree or strength of your privacy protections on the one hand and the accuracy or availability of the data on the other. And this is how those methods work. It's not a side effect, it's a feature, if you will. And the parameters of your method's implementation are what determine that balance. Now, traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance have some problems in this regard. They traditionally provide very little ability to quantify the strength of the privacy protection, especially when you're making multiple data releases that are derived from the same confidential data source. Disclosure avoidance methods have traditionally largely been kind of subjective in nature, relying on expert understanding and knowledge rather than on any kind of quantifiable mechanism for assessing disclosure risk. So as practitioners of disclosure avoidance have been faced with rising threats to privacy protection or faced with rising disclosure risk, they've had to adjust their parameters. But understanding how much they need to adjust them has been challenging in the absence of ways to quantify that degree of privacy risk. And what this has led to is that traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance have been largely scattershot solutions that tend to overprotect some data, making them less accurate than they could be otherwise for the same degree of privacy protection, while also underprotecting the most vulnerable records in the data that you're looking to publish. So this brings us to differential privacy. Differential privacy is not a disclosure avoidance method the same way data swapping or cell suppression is a method, as much as differential privacy is a kind of privacy risk accounting framework for defining privacy risk and then quantifying it for use with another method. Every individual that's reflected in any statistic that you're publishing contributes towards that statistic's value. They're reflected in that data you're publishing. And as I mentioned before, every statistic that you publish is going to reveal or leak a tiny bit of confidential information in the process. So differential privacy, as this privacy risk accounting framework, allows you to assess each and every individual's contribution to all of the statistics that you're publishing, and to measure, and by measuring it, then limit how much information about those individuals will leak in the data that you're publishing. So when you combine differential privacy's kind of risk accounting framework with a disclosure avoidance method like noise injection,
DP allows you to precisely control the amount of confidential information leakage that's going to occur in your published statistics. And this offers a number of important advantages over traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance. For starters, differential privacy and differentially private noise injection is infinitely tunable. The parameters or dials of your implementation can be very finely tuned and can be set anywhere on the spectrum from perfect privacy at the one extreme to perfect accuracy at the other. Perhaps more importantly, this quantification of privacy risk leads to a privacy guarantee that you can give to your respondents that is both mathematically provable and future-proof. You don't have to worry about what new third-party data is going to be available or what additional advances to computing power are going to occur after you've released the data. And thirdly, the precise calibration, the fact that you can precisely calibrate the method's implementation through this framework enables optimal data accuracy for any given level of privacy protection. And this marks a notable divergence from that scattershot solution of traditional approaches to disclosure avoidance that I mentioned before. So to understand how differential privacy is being adopted for the 2020 census, it's helpful to understand a little bit about the scope of the 2020 census data products. And so we've kind of divided these into kind of three buckets of data products here. The first, which we internally and informally call the Group 1 data products, include the Public Law 94-171 redistricting data summary file, which we released over the summer, along with the demographic profile and the demographic and housing characteristics file. The second bucket of data products include the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file. And then there's a third group that include a number of yet to be determined data products, such as perhaps public use microdata, special tabulations, researcher access to census data through the Federal Statistical Research Data Centers, and other out-year uses of 2020 census data. So with these three kind of bins of data products in mind, we've developed a set of different algorithms that we're going to be using, all based on differential privacy, to protect these different data products in different ways. And we've selected these based on the particular and unique challenges associated with each of those data products. So those Group 1 data products, the redistricting data and the demographic and housing characteristics file and the demographic profiles, are being protected using an algorithm known as the top-down algorithm. And the TDA produces as its output privacy-protected microdata in the form of the microdata detail file, which are then ingested by the decennial program's tabulation systems to produce the tables that are released to the public. The second group of data products, including the detailed demographic and housing characteristics file, are protected using two other differentially private algorithms called SafeTab and PHSafe. And those produce the privacy-protected tabulations directly, essentially bypassing that microdata step. And then the Group 3 products will be protected using one or more of those algorithms or other formally private solutions based on the needs of those particular products. So to understand kind of the decision-making that's involved in implementing these methods, it's helpful to understand what the privacy lost budget is. And so any disclosure avoidance mechanism that you want to use, as I mentioned before, imposes this fundamental trade-off between data protection on the one hand, that's the degree of privacy or confidentiality, and data accuracy or fitness for use on the other. And you can think of this as a spectrum from 0 on the one hand, where you have perfect privacy and completely useless data, to infinity on the other, where you have perfect data with no confidentiality protections to speak of. The goal in determining the parameters, the privacy loss budget for your data products, is to find the point on that spectrum between the extremes where you have sufficient accuracy to meet the intended use cases for the data, the reason you're publishing them, while also having sufficient confidentiality protections to meet your legal and ethical obligations to safeguard the data. And once you've identified that point on the spectrum where the data are sufficiently accurate and sufficiently protected, that point on the spectrum becomes known as your privacy loss budget. And you'll see this reflected as the acronym PLB, or as the Greek letters epsilon or rho, depending on the source that you're looking at. Now, your privacy loss budget reflects your global privacy guarantee, that mathematically provable guarantee for confidentiality protection that I mentioned before. And shares of that privacy loss budget then have to get allocated to each of the data products that you want to release. So we had a share of privacy loss budget that was used to produce the redistricting data that we released back in August. We'll be allocating another share of privacy loss budget to produce the demographic and housing characteristics product, and then additional shares for the Group 2 data products and the ultimate Group 3 data products. And you add all of those together, and that becomes your global privacy loss budget, which forms that mathematical confidentiality guarantee. But then within each of your data products, you then have to also allocate shares of that privacy loss budget to all of the calculations and tabulations that you're going to be producing. So what you can see here is the shares of privacy loss budget that were allocated to, on the left-hand side, statistics at the national level, the state level, the county level, the tract level, block group level, and block level for the redistricting data that we released back in August. And on the right-hand table, you can see the shares within each of those geographic levels that were allocated to the different statistics that we were calculating. So the shares allocated to counts of total population, or the shares allocated to the race variable, or the cross-tabulation of race by ethnicity, or the cross-tabulation of voting age and race, etc. Each of those fractions represented in these tables shows the share of the privacy loss budget that was assigned to those statistics. And each of those shares then determine the relative accuracy of the resulting data that are shown. So the larger the proportion of privacy loss budget allocated to total population, for example, relative to the size of the privacy loss budget allocated to the race variable, will determine the relative accuracy of your total population counts versus your racial detail. And we set the shares of the privacy loss budget for the redistricting data product based on extensive experimentation and tuning of our algorithms against accuracy targets that we constructed through substantial engagement and extensive engagement with our data user communities. So over the past 2 years, the Census Bureau has released 6 sets of demonstration data that were generated by running 2010 census data through our 2020 census disclosure system. And this has allowed our data users to compare the differentially private results to the results that were actually published after the 2010 census that were protected using swapping. So the 2010 published tabulations did have noise in them from this swapping mechanism, but these demonstration data products allowed our data users to compare the differentially private versions to the noisy published 2010 versions protected using swapping. And the feedback and analyses that we received from our stakeholders after each of these data products, these demonstration data products, helped us to tune and to adjust our algorithms to ensure that the resulting data will meet our data users' needs. So, as I mentioned, we've published the redistricting data already, and we're turning our attention to the tuning of the algorithm for the production of the demographic and housing characteristics file, the DHC. And we've learned a lot from our stakeholder engagements that we've done to date, and we intend to build on that experience as we do our tuning for the DHC. So our engagement plan includes a 3-pronged approach. Engagement and education, where we're going with differential privacy in the DHC, how do we get there? Feedback and listening, how are the DHC tables used? For what purpose are you using them? And how can we better tune the algorithm to meet your use cases? And then perhaps most importantly, demonstration and implementation. Are the data fit for use? What are the privacy accuracy trade-offs, etc.? And so building on the experience that we had producing the redistricting data, we will be producing demonstration data again for the DHC file implementation, where we run 2010 census data through the algorithm with different parameter settings to allow our data users to evaluate the resulting output. We're going to do at least 2 rounds of demonstration data releases with at least 30 days of review and feedback after each. And that feedback will then further inform additional tuning that will be done to the algorithm. And then after that second set of demonstration data will inform final decision making about the parameters of the algorithm's implementation for the actual production run of the DHC. We do plan on to continue our ongoing stakeholder engagement, including with our advisory and stakeholder groups, such as the one shown here, our advisory committees, the American Indian Alaska Native tribal leaders through formal consultation, the National Academy of Sciences Committee on National Statistics, absolutely through the SDC network and CIC network, with our federal agency partners, and with our congressional appropriations and oversight committees and their staff. So what is kind of the notional timeline for this development? Well, this fall, we're in the process of tuning the algorithms, and that includes collecting data use cases from all of you, and my colleagues will be talking more about that in their presentations. But understanding and better understanding your uses of DHC data is going to help us to set accuracy targets and finalize the specs of the DHC for the tuning. Then in winter of 2021, early 2022, we're going to release our first set of demonstration data based on that first round of tuning. We'll collect feedback on the fitness for use of the resulting data, and then we'll assess that feedback and incorporate changes into our parameter implementation. And then we'll reassess our timeline and communicate status at that point. Then in the spring of 2022, after we've done that additional tuning, we're going to release a second set of demonstration data. We're going to conduct another public workshop in partnership with the Committee on National Statistics, like we did with the CNStat workshop back in December of 2019. We'll collect feedback and assessments based on that second set of demonstration data, and that will inform the setting of final parameters for the DHC in summer of 2022 that will be used for the actual production run. Here's a graphical representation of that notional timeline. You'll notice the points there where demonstration data are being released. You'll notice the decision points along the way, privacy loss budget for the first set of demonstration data, for the second set of demonstration data, and then for the final production settings. And you'll notice the 3 feedback periods marked, where getting stakeholder feedback will be absolutely critical. If you want to stay informed of our modernization of disclosure avoidance for the 2020 census, I highly recommend that you sign up for our 2020 Census Data Products newsletter. That way you can get all the late-breaking news on our implementation of differential privacy for the 2020 census. You can sign up for this just by going to census.gov and searching disclosure avoidance. And if you want to learn more about our modernization efforts, or if you want to learn more about differential privacy and our implementation of it, definitely check out our website. We've got a lot of great resources available there, including frequently asked questions, webinars and trainings, issue papers, fun little informative videos, and much, much more. So definitely check that out. Again, just go to census.gov and search disclosure avoidance. We also just recently released a great little short video entitled Protecting Privacy in Census Bureau Statistics. This is a great intro into differential privacy for non-technical audiences. It's a great way of explaining how we're injecting noise into the data in order to protect your privacy. And with that, I will open things up for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. That was a very great presentation, very informative. I have a couple of questions here. I would like to ask or read it out for you. Let me see if I can bring that up here. Just a moment. So this was a question we received in the chat box. What factors guided the Bureau in landing on the final PLB? Example, sufficient privacy versus sufficient accuracy balance?
So I missed the very end of that. I heard the first part of the question, but you said the for example, and I couldn't hear what you said at that point.
Is it the sufficient privacy versus sufficient accuracy balance?
That was a policy decision. It was a difficult policy decision that we spent a lot of time evaluating. Essentially, what it boiled down to was we got substantial feedback from our data users after our most recent set of demonstration data that we released back in April. Our Data Stewardship Executive Policy Committee, which is the executive level policy governance group that are making these decisions, evaluated that feedback. They evaluated a number of runs of our disclosure avoidance system with different parameter settings against a wide range of accuracy targets that were developed based on internal use cases and external use cases of the redistricting data. They evaluated the strength of the privacy guarantee through the privacy loss budget. And then they found a set of parameters, the allocations of privacy loss budget that best met those accuracy targets while still protecting against our known vulnerabilities of census data from the privacy perspective. So there was a extensive discussion, extensive evaluation, and the feedback we got from our data users was central to that.
Right. Thanks, Michael. Thanks for answering that. And I do remember participating and looking at the 2010 data that was subject to differential privacy a few different times, and we were able to provide feedback to the Census Bureau, and most of it was taken into consideration. And this has been going on for more than a year before it was finalized, I guess, right? So that's another question here. Actually, there are a few questions. Hopefully, you have a few minutes to go over them. So,
yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. So this question is, how reliable is this adjusted Census 20 data for communities / municipalities with fewer than 500 or 200 or maybe 100 persons, the small municipalities, I guess? Will the Census 2020 figure be consistent with growth over the previous decades?
So there's a lot packed into that question, and I can't give you a comprehensive answer to that right now. But in a nutshell, it's important to recognize that the nature of the noise injection here is that your lowest levels of geography, your individual census blocks, will be the noisiest. But that as you aggregate those blocks together into geographies of interest, that noise largely cancels out to a large degree. And the more you aggregate together, the more that noise will cancel out. So as you look at larger geographies with larger underlying populations, the relative error will diminish. And so we have different accuracy targets that we've been using for different statistics and different data products. We actually published a whole newsletter on the accuracy targets that we used for tuning the redistricting data product for redistricting use cases and Voting Rights Act purposes. That was informed from discussions with the U.S. Department of Justice and other redistricting stakeholders. We had accuracy targets that we were looking at for demographic use cases of the redistricting data as well. And we targeted those for relative accuracy for different size jurisdictions, both kind of on the traditional geographic hierarchy and off. So not just kind of your census tracts and block groups, but also things like census designated places, incorporated places, minor civil divisions, and so on. And we found accuracy targets that we felt reflected our data users' needs at those different levels. What those targets will be for the demographic and housing characteristics file is still to be determined, and that's where feedback from all of you will be very helpful. So definitely provide the feedback for the data table crosswalk that we have out now with your use cases, And as we release the demonstration data, let us know what your own analyses are finding, and we'll incorporate that feedback into our decision making on relative accuracy for the DHC. All
right. Thank you, Michael. I have a question related to redistricting data that you mentioned. So this question is basically, with DAS injected to the PL data, can we say with confidence data would not skew or impact the Voting Rights Act requirements? When districts are redrawn, would they preserve the minority composition, be it congressional, state level Senate, or delegate districts in Maryland?
So we have very carefully documented the fitness for use of the 2020 Census redistricting data for the redistricting use case and for Voting Rights Act enforcement. If you want the specifics of that, we have an excellent technical paper by my colleagues Tommy Wright and Kylie Ramada. And Tommy, Kyle, and I did a webinar on this topic. I would point you to that, and that gives all the specifics about how we documented the fitness for use in these cases.
So, okay, that's fine. Like, I'm thinking more about, like, if there's a question that's asked at a public meeting, would this data meet the requirements? Can we say with confidence, yes, it does, and leave it at that, and point them to the technical documentation?
Yeah, as I said, we've carefully documented the fitness for use of the data, and like all of that documentation is available. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Michael. So there some of these questions are long. Be patient. Ask me to repeat if you did not follow through, but I'll try to read them here. So this is a question slash comment from Pamela Zorich. So this is the first time I recall that the Census Bureau has issued a caution for using block group level decennial census data. Can you address or share useful tips or cautions for how data users may appropriately analyze 2020 census block group and block level data?
So great question. So there are a number of sources of error in census data. There's coverage error, measurement error, operational error, and disclosure avoidance error. And the introduction of noise for confidentiality protections is not new. There was noise injected into characteristics data for the 2000 and 2010 censuses. Now, the challenge is that to our data users, the impact of those confidentiality protections was largely opaque because the security of those mechanisms required us to withhold assessments of what the impact on data accuracy were. But note that there was error in these data in prior censuses. It's just you didn't know how much or how much it impacted them. We are providing guidance on this. We have a handbook on using the redistricting data that will be coming out in the coming weeks. That goes through a number of kind of pointers for supported uses and not supported uses as well. So keep an eye out for that handbook. That will be going into a lot of detail in this regard.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So this next question, based on DP presentation, is it correct that the next release of 2020 census data will not be until summer of 2022?
So what I shared in my slides was our notional timeline for production of the demographic and housing characteristics file. There are a number of factors that could still impact that timeline that could either lengthen or shorten it, and we'll communicate any changes as they occur. But I do want to point out that that endpoint in the notional timeline that I shared was for the production run of the DHC file through the disclosure avoidance system. There is additional work that needs to be done to the data once disclosure avoidance has been applied, tabulation, quality assurance, etc. Those are not reflected in the schedule, and I do not know how long those will take. But the current notional timeline has us doing the production run in summer of 22.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So I'm going to the next question from Sean Kimberly. This is a long question. please ask me to repeat if you don't get all of it. So 2020 decennial census, PL 94-171, fitness for use question. Understanding that all population totals below the state level are subject to DP, at what level of geography do data users need to be concerned about the quality of the totals provided? And then he goes on, I appreciate that the answer likely depends upon the population in the selected geography. But do you have some benchmarks, suggestions for appropriate use of data? Again, for example, would the Census Bureau advise not to use data from individual blocks, and the block level data should only be used when aggregating to user-defined geographies? He's saying, thinking about transportation analysis zones here.
Yeah, in general, the relative error in blocks will be substantial, but as I said, the noise of those blocks diminishes as you aggregate them together into your user-defined geographies. In general, and we've released detailed summary metrics that provide measures of absolute error and relative error for different characteristics for different types and levels of geography. So for specifics there, I would point you to those detailed summary metrics of the production settings, because that can give you much more concrete answers to your specific data use needs. But yeah, in general, you're going to need to aggregate those blocks together to get reliable statistics. And how you aggregate them, it's usually going to be aggregating them to geographies of approximately, and I don't have the numbers in front of me, I want to say about 250 individuals for off-spine geographies and like 400 for on-spines. So largely when you get to that size, your relative error will be diminished enough that you're getting reliable statistics. But yeah, check out the detailed summary metrics. That goes into much more detail by data element, by type of geography, et cetera.
All right. Thank you, Michael. So this is another question we received through chat. The use of synthetic data for ACS going forward, how would it impact the estimates, I guess, because like the ACS data is also subject to a margin of error.
Okay, so the Census Bureau is committed to modernizing the privacy protections for all of our censuses and surveys. We've been talking today about the protections for the 2020 decennial census. We recognize that there's a lot of interest in how modernization of disclosure avoidance is going to impact the ACS. No decisions have yet been made on the modernized privacy protections for the ACS. We have publicly stated that no changes are going to be made regarding adoption of differential privacy for the ACS until at least 2025. Again, no decisions yet. As decisions are made, and as we're doing stakeholder engagement to inform those decisions, we will be communicating with the SDC network and with all of our other stakeholder groups to inform that decision making. But for the time being, it would be premature to be speculating.
Just a quick follow-up. So DAS will be subject to the ACS release not this year, but coming next year, where it's going to switch over to the 2020 geographies and the 2020 census base? Or is it going to be subject to the data release that's going to come out in December, the 5-year ACS?
So I would defer that question to my ACS colleagues. I do not know about their production schedule. So.
Okay. All right. Like if you have some contact information for the ACS folks, we might want to reach out to them later on.
Okay. Yeah, I can certainly provide that for you.
All right. Thank you. So we have this question from Chuck Boyd. So as planners, we often look at past numbers and compare them with the current values to get a sense of what happened and why. By adding this DP, will we have confidence in the comparison results, especially when it comes to land planning and utilities? I assume that you look at the numbers from smaller geographies. We should be less confident in the comparative results. That's a question.
So again, that's going to depend on precisely which data you're looking at, which data elements, and those are all kind of determined by the share of privacy loss budget allocated and what level of geography you're looking at. Again, there has been noise in prior censuses, so there's always going to be this issue to some degree. I recognize that the noise from differential privacy is going to change the dynamics of that in some ways, but I will point you to the forthcoming handbook that does go into some of that, and we'll be releasing more information down the road.
Okay, thank you, Michael. So again, like this is a much longer question. I'll try to read it out slowly, and please ask me to repeat if you didn't get any part of it. So this question is from Kui Zhao. She is asking, the Census Bureau is debating whether or not to release the demographic profile and DHC files to the same geographic detail as in 2010. The demographic profile, for example, would only be released down to the census designated place rather than the census tract level. Similarly, while most of the data in the DHC appears to remain at the same level, demographic and housing characteristics at a small geography, at least census tracts, are critical and meaningful for local government planning for development of comprehensive plans, also known as master plans. Community plans, housing plans, transportation plans, recreation and park plans, and various plans. I recommend maintaining the tabulation of characteristics at a small geography, the same as or smaller than census tracts, which are fundamental for local government planning. Again, this is more like a statement, and do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, absolutely. This is exactly the sort of feedback that we've been asking for. So we released the proposed table crosswalk showing tables published in 2010 and what is currently proposed for inclusion in the demographic and housing characteristics file, detailed DHC and demographic profile, showing the correspondence and what proposed changes in geographic detail or characteristic detail for each of those tables. The comment included some valuable feedback there, and we want that feedback from our stakeholders. So I would recommend that if they haven't already, that they submit that to 2020 DAS at census.gov. That's our data products shared mailbox that we all are reviewing. That feedback will help us finalize the table specs for the DHC and the demographic profiles.
All right. I'm not sure if it was me. Sorry, your video and audio froze for the last few seconds. Can you just repeat the last part of that answer?
Yeah, so if they haven't already, that feedback that was provided in the comments, they should submit it to our feedback email box, 2020DAS at census.gov.
Okay. All right, thank you, Michael. And this is the last question we have here for you. Sorry, so many questions, but this is a very interesting topic. So Beth is asking, should we expect the data in the DHC will not necessarily match the data in PL 94171? Example, population by race, Hispanic or Latino by race.
So great question. The top-down algorithm was designed to be able to enforce consistency across data products. So our current default is that the DHC data will be consistent with the data that was published in the redistricting file. If that changes, we will communicate that change to our stakeholders, but the current plan is for the DHC to be consistent.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Thanks for answering all the questions, and it was a great presentation, very informative, and it kind of helps us be confident that the data that we are submitting to the Census Bureau is going to be keep confident and people cannot use to identify individuals. So we're going to end this presentation now, and we will take a 5-minute break. It's 10:55. We will join back at 11 o'clock and continue on with the rest of the program here. So hope everybody is back from the break. We will get started fairly soon. We will have Secretary McCord say a few words to us.
Morning, everyone. It's Rob McCord. I'm the Secretary of the Department of Planning. Al, is this the time that you need me to speak?
No, you're good to go, Secretary. You can speak now.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So the important work done at the State Data Center and state data centers across the country happens year in and year out. I'm very much aware of that. And once every 10 years, we get an avalanche of new data courtesy of all the hard work that we did to increase the census responses. This gives us even more work and allows us, among other things, to check our projections, reset our expectations, and to begin to see all that is to be learned from that decennial count. Additionally, it sets in motion all the processes that go into redistricting, that lovely process. Redistricting, the most wonderful time of the decade. So that's the Department of Planning supports that effort here in the state of Maryland on behalf of the Governor's Commission. He has a commission of 3 independents and 3 Democrats and 3 Republicans, the Maryland Citizens Redistricting Commission, that is going along in its processes along with a commission that the General Assembly has put together. So that process is really quite it's intensive at the moment, and it's quite a data-driven process, as you know. But putting that to the side, you know how much we live in a culture that craves data. But we know that data is only one component of the information that we need to make decisions. There's always 2 parts to the question, whether they're articulated this way or not. What is the data and why is the data? Basically, why is the data the way it is and how do we get there? That second question is informed by the first. Informed, but not always directly answered by the first. There are certain things that only humans can tell about the why of the data. We need intelligent people putting their full brain power to that task. We make educated guesses. We assemble the data to support our conclusions, analyze trends in the data. We look at when the curve turns downward and when there's spikes. We're adults that admit that we need to correct course once in a while. All of this has implications for policymaking and projections. At the beginning of the pandemic, some people predicted it would be like a massive snowstorm and lead to a baby boom. But it seems to be turning out in some places to be a baby bust. There may be a dip in births that will show up about 5 years from now as empty seats in classrooms. But there's also swirling migration trends that could cancel some of that out. We need to keep a careful eye on that to make sure that we avoid spending billions of dollars building bigger classrooms in areas where the population is really going down. We have new and interesting ways to present data, moving beyond the pie chart and the bar graph, new ways to show the data and what it's trying to tell us. Those data visualizations, especially the new ones from the US Census Bureau, they're fantastic. They need to be accurate, and all the caveats and instructions need to be available. People love to run with just one piece of the puzzle. I'm not telling you anything new in anything I've said so far. People like to run with one piece of the puzzle and try to build it into an explanation that fits a preconceived notion and not a well thought out hypothesis. So I urge you to continue to stand for the integrity of the data that you represent in your agencies, respectively across the country. We can do that when we understand and articulate the limits of the data. So we're proud of what we can do. We're proud of, in Maryland, the way the State Data Center has supported the entire Maryland COVID response process. We have dedicated 12.5% of our staff to the health department in the time when it made a real big difference. We have had people detailed to the health department for many, many months. and sometimes up to almost a year. And we've done that to make sure that everything that every other agency is doing can be supported by good data, and that we have people who can analyze data and give information that helps make informed decisions on how we can keep people healthy. So I'm really proud of the work that we've done in that area. I'm proud of the work that we do for school projections, proud of the work that we do here in Maryland to make sure that we have the best available data to make the best decisions we can make. So I will not hold you any longer, and I'm proud of what you do. As you gather to touch base as professionals, I want you to know that I appreciate and admire the work that you do. I hope your time together is beneficial, and I can tell you that the State Data Center here in Maryland has been an integral part of what the state has been doing ever since I've been part of this Department of Planning. So thank you very much, and thank you, Al, for giving me the time to allow me to speak today. Thanks.
Thank you, Secretary McCord. Thanks for speaking to us. We will move on to the next presentation on the 2020 Census Diversity Index by Nicholas Jones and Eric Jensen from the Census Bureau.
Good morning, and thank you, Al. I just wanted to confirm I need to share the second window, and just do that here in a second.
Okay.
Okay, could you confirm, Al or John, are you able to see the second screen? I know it's not in presentation mode yet, but just seeing if you're able to see the slide deck.
No, all we're seeing is the sorter view, the slide sorter view. We're not seeing the full slides.
Okay.
Now we
All
are.
right, how about now?
Good.
Just wanted to confirm.
You're good.
Yeah.
Okay, great, thank you. And you're able to hear me okay?
Yes, you sound good. Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Nicholas Jones. I'm the director of the Census Bureau's Race and Ethnicity Research and Outreach Program, and I'm joined this morning by my colleague, Eric Jensen, who's the Census Bureau's senior technical expert for demographic analysis. We welcome this opportunity to talk with all of you today about statistics from the 2020 census on race and ethnicity and the measures of diversity that we developed to communicate the results for our nation and for communities and states across the country. Before we begin, Eric and I just wanted to say thank you to Al, to Krishna, and to John for helping us to be here with you today. And we're really excited about the opportunity to share the results with you directly. As our country's grown, we've continued to evolve in how we measure the race and ethnicity of the people who live here. And the 2020 census redistricting data provide a new snapshot of the composition of the country as a result of the improvements in the designs of the questions that we ask and the improvements that we made to our data processing and the coding of what people tell us about their racial and ethnic identifications. The improvements we made for 2020 yield a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify in response to two separate questions on Hispanic origin and race. And the results reveal that the US population is much more multiracial and more diverse than what we measured in the past. And this is also true for the state of Maryland. The first half of our presentation is going to discuss improvements that we made to the 2020 census race and Hispanic origin data, highlighting the racial and ethnic composition at a national level and for the state of Maryland. The 2020 census data provide a new snapshot of the racial and ethnic composition and the racial and ethnic diversity of our nation and our states and our communities. To help the public understand the results, we went into great detail with two America Count stories that are shown here and available on our census.gov website. We encourage you to read them to find out more about the results. While the Census Bureau successfully tested and recommended a combined race and ethnicity question design for the 2020 census, we followed the 1997 standards set by the US Office of Management and Budget, and we must use two separate questions to collect data on race and ethnicity. Our research over the past decade, however, showed that we could make improvements to the question designs within the 1997 OMB guidelines. Our research over the past decade enabled us to improve the ways we process the data and how we code the responses to the questions on race and Hispanic origin. This work began over a decade ago with our 2010 alternative questionnaire experiment research and continued in 2015 with our research and testing centered on findings from our 2015 national content test. And the designs were implemented in the 2018 census test to prepare for 2020. The improvements and the changes enable a more thorough and a more accurate depiction of how people self-identify, resulting in a more accurate portrait of how people report their Hispanic origin and their race within the context of this two separate question format. Again, the changes reveal that we're much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past, and we're confident that the differences in the overall racial distributions are largely due to improvements in the design of the two separate questions for the data collection and processing, as well as some demographic changes over the past 10 years. We're also confident, as shown in our research over the past decade, that using a single combined question for race and ethnicity in the decennial census would ultimately yield a more accurate portrait of how the US population self-identifies, especially for people who self-identify as multiracial or multi-ethnic. We describe these results in great detail in our America Counts stories with an overview of race and ethnicity. The results are not surprising as they align with our expert research and corresponding findings this past decade about the impacts of two separate questions and that format on race and ethnicity reporting. The improvements more accurately illustrate the richness and the complexity of how people self-identify in response to these questions in the current OMB standards. So there are multiple approaches to presenting and understanding data on race and ethnicity, and these concepts are emphasized in our reports and our presentations when we talk about race alone, race in combination, and race or alone or in combination, as well as Hispanic origin by race. These concepts have been in place since the Census 2000 with the 1997 OMB standards guiding them, and they're central to our understanding of our country's changing demographics. One common way to examine data on race and ethnicity is to cross-tabulate Hispanic origin by race using the statistics from redistricting table P2. In this table shell shown on the screen, the Hispanic or Latino population is shown as a distinct table row, followed by the not Hispanic or Latino population, and then a cross-tabulation of the not Hispanic Latino population for the non-Hispanic race alone groups and the full set of 57 not Hispanic multiple race combinations. In the companion America Counts story that we released on August 12th, we illustrate how the 2020 census results allow us to measure the nation's racial and ethnic diversity and how it varies at different geographic levels. We explore multiple measures of racial and ethnic diversity, and for these measures, we cross-tabulate the race and Hispanic origin statistics, as data users often do, such as with the 2020 census redistricting table P2 that I just showed. In this format, the results are not as impacted by the race reporting patterns of Hispanic or Latino respondents, as the Hispanic or Latino population is included as a category alongside the racial categories. And thus, we're confident that the changes we're seeing in diversity measures from 2010 to 2020, because they calculate mutually exclusive Hispanic origin by race groups, likely reflect actual demographic changes in the population, as well as improvements to the question designs, data processing, and coding. So our measures of diversity enable us to see how all racial and ethnic groups are distributed across the country to inform that understanding of diversity. Our definition for diversity refers to the representation and relative size of different racial and ethnic groups within a population and its geographic area. Diversity is maximized when all groups are represented in an area and have equal shares of the population. We're using several approaches to measure the racial and ethnic diversity of our population. These include, as shown here on the screen, the diversity index, prevalence rankings, and the diffusion score, and a series of prevalence maps. We're going to walk through each of these measures in the next few minutes and discuss the results, and then Eric is going to show you through a workshop how you can build these data for yourself using data.census.gov. To help set the stage with the next slide, we present a state-level map using data from the 2010 census. The map shows the geographic distribution of the diversity index score across the country from state to state. The states shown in dark green were more diverse, with a diversity index score of 65% or more in 2010. States shown in light green were less diverse in 2010. And again, the diversity measure tells us the probability that two people chosen at random will be from different race and ethnicity groups. The diversity index is bounded between 0 and 1. A value of 0 indicates that everyone in the population has the same racial and ethnic characteristics. A value close to 1 indicates that almost everyone in the population has different racial and ethnic characteristics. Next, we have a map calculating the diversity index for the 2020 census. In 2020, at the national level, there was a 61.1% chance that two people chosen at random were from different race and ethnicity groups. This is higher than 2010, when the diversity index was 54.9. In 2020, Hawaii had the highest diversity index at 76%, followed by California with 69.7%, and Nevada with 68.8%. The state of Maryland was notable in that it had the fourth highest diversity index in the nation. Further, among the 10 states with the highest diversity index in 2020, Maryland had the largest diversity index gain, increasing from 60.7% in 2010 to 67.3% in 2020. You can see the diversity index for all states, including Maryland, using our interactive Tableau data visualizations on diversity that were released on our website. I've posted a couple images from the tool to help illustrate how the diversity index results look for the state of Maryland by county. The diversity levels are shown for 2010 in the map on the left and shown for 2020 with the map on the right. In general, states with the highest diversity index scores tend to have additional groups beyond just the three largest racial and ethnic groups, which for Maryland in 2020 were white alone non-Hispanic, Black or African American alone non-Hispanic, and Hispanic or Latino. In addition to these groups, Maryland also has a relatively large Asian alone non-Hispanic population and multiracial non-Hispanic population, with 6.8% and 4.4% respectively. Taking a closer look, another feature of our DataViz tool enables you to create a bar chart of all the counties in Maryland and the diversity index score. The ranking on the left shows diversity in 2010 by county, and the ranking on the right shows diversity in 2020 by county. In 2020, the Maryland counties with the highest diversity index were Montgomery County at 73.5%, Howard County at 69.6%, Charles County at 63.9%, and Baltimore County at 63.2%. All of these scores for these counties are higher than the National Diversity Index of 61.1%. Another diversity measure we developed are prevalence ranking graphs. And shown here on the screen, these graphs show the percentage of the population that falls into the largest race or ethnic group, the second largest group, and the third largest group. In the graphic, the color of the bars represent the different racial and ethnic groups shown in the legend on the left. Looking at the orange bars in column 1, we see that the white alone, not Hispanic population was the most prevalent racial or ethnic group for all states, except for the states of California, Hawaii, New Mexico, and the District of Columbia, a state equivalent, as well as Puerto Rico. In 2020, the Hispanic or Latino population, shown in green, became the largest racial or ethnic group in California, comprising 39.4% of the population, up from 37.6% 10 years ago. Black or African American non-Hispanic, shown in blue, was the second most prevalent group in the District of Columbia. Asian non-Hispanic, shown in red, was the most prevalent group in Hawaii. And the Hispanic or Latino population, again shown in green, was the most prevalent group in New Mexico and in Puerto Rico. As another measure for diversity, we also present the diffusion score. This measures the percentage of the population that is not the first, second, or third largest race or ethnic group combined. The metric shown in gray by the far right bar tells us how diverse and unconcentrated the population is relative to the largest group. The 2020 census results show that Hawaii was the state with the highest diffusion score at 21.8%, followed by Alaska, Oklahoma, and Nevada, all above 16%. Now, Maryland already had a high diversity index score in 2010 with 60.7%, in part because of the relatively large Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population, which was 29% 10 years ago. Looking at the prevalence bars from Maryland, we see that over the decade, the proportion of the population that was white alone non-Hispanic decreased from 54.7% to 47.2%. And the proportion Black or African American alone non-Hispanic had relatively no change. This means that the diversity index score came from other racial and ethnic groups. For example, the Asian alone non-Hispanic population increased from 5.5% in 2010 to 6.8% in 2020. And the multiracial non-Hispanic population also increased from 2.2% to 4.4%. These are part of the diffusion score in the far right bar. Finally, the portion of the population that was Hispanic in Maryland increased from 8.2% to 11.8%, shown in green. You can utilize our racial and ethnic diversity data visualization to calculate the prevalence graphics for counties across the state of Maryland. This image from the data viz shows the results for 2020. Prevalence rankings illustrate the percentage of the population that falls into the first, second, or third largest racial or ethnic groups. The most prevalent racial or ethnic group in Maryland, shown in orange, was the white alone non-Hispanic population at 47.2% on the top right, on the top bar, and also in column 1 for most counties in Maryland, again shown by the orange bars. The Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population was the second largest racial or ethnic group for the state of Maryland, comprising 29.1% of the population. And the blue bars show that the Black or African American alone non-Hispanic population was the most prevalent group in Baltimore City, Charles County, and Prince George's County. You can also see in column 2, Black or African American alone non-Hispanic was the second most prevalent population in 16 Maryland counties. The third most prevalent group for the state in 2020 was the Hispanic or Latino population, which comprised 11.8% of Maryland's population. This is shown with the green bar also in column 3, where we see Hispanic or Latino was the second most prevalent group in Carroll County, Frederick County, Montgomery County, and Prince George's County. From these graphics, we can also see that the multiracial non-Hispanic population, shown in teal in column 2 and column 3, was the most prevalent group in second most prevalent group in Garrett County, Maryland, and the third most prevalent group in the counties of Allegheny, Calvert, Carroll, and St. Mary's. Finally, we also see that the Asian alone non-Hispanic population, shown in red in column 2, was the second most prevalent group in Howard County. We also calculate the diffusion score. Again, this measures the combined percentage of all racial and ethnic groups that are not in the first, second, or third largest group. The calculation shown in the far right column tells us how diverse and diffused the population is relative to the other groups. The higher the score, the less concentrated the population is in the 3 largest groups. In the top row, we see for Maryland that the diffusion score was 12.0%. The counties with the highest diffusion scores were Montgomery County at 20.8%, Howard County at 14.1%, and Baltimore County at 11.4%. Finally, another measure we use is a series of prevalence maps, and these show the geographic distributions and patterns in racial and ethnic diversity across the country. The first map displayed here shows the most prevalent race or ethnicity group by county for 2020. The non-Hispanic white alone population, shown in orange, was the most prevalent group in about 90% of counties. Black or African American alone non-Hispanic, shown in blue, was the most prevalent group in some counties in the South. Hispanic or Latino, shown in green, was the most prevalent in counties in the Southwest and West. And in addition, the American Indian Alaska Native alone non-Hispanic population, shown in purple, was the most prevalent group in the counties in Alaska, the Four Corners region, and parts of the Upper Great Plains. Now, there's more variation in the map for the second most prevalent racial or ethnic group, and this is shown here on the next slide. What we see now is that there are more racial or ethnic groups represented, and the patterns are not as tightly clustered in specific regions. For example, Hispanic or Latino, shown in green, was the second most prevalent group and spanned the entire continental US, with large numbers of counties in every region. And the multiracial non-Hispanic population, shown in teal, was the second most prevalent group in many counties throughout the northern part of the country. You can use our data diversity viz tool to zoom in and see the prevalence map distributions for Maryland, and you can see differences for counties across the state of Maryland. This screenshot from that tool shows us the first most prevalent group map for Maryland counties in 2020. Selecting the second most prevalent group for the 2020, we get a different dimension of diversity across Maryland counties. You can also toggle back and forth between the first most prevalent map, the second most prevalent, and the third most prevalent map as well as looking at data for 2010 and 2020. Now today I've shown you static images from the DataViz tool to introduce you to its capabilities, but you can explore the data from Maryland and for counties in Maryland using our interactive data visualizations. We encourage you to use these to explore the interactive maps and graphics which illustrate the 2020 results and compare them to 2010. You can access these from census.gov, and also our Census Bureau colleagues produced data gems, which are short videos to walk you through how to use the data visualizations in a step-by-step format. Finally, I want to encourage you to read our America Counts stories on our census website to really made for the 2020 census, which yield a more accurate portrait of how people self-identify in response to two separate questions on ethnicity and on race. Our analysis of the 2020 census results show the US population is much more multiracial and more racially and ethnically diverse than what we measured in the past. These concepts of racial and ethnic diversity help inform the public discussion about diversity and the complexity of the racial and ethnic composition of our country. The measures of diversity complement the 2020 Census Redistricting data release, and the data enable us to explore the richness and complexity of our nation's population in a new light. So next, I'm going to turn to my colleague Eric Jensen, who's going to do the second half of our presentation to provide a data workshop so you can learn how to calculate these measures of racial and ethnic diversity for yourself using statistics from data.census.gov.
All right, thanks, Nicholas. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yes.
Great, thank you.
Sure.
So I'm going to talk about how you can use the data.census.gov website to get the data from their districting files, and then how to use Microsoft Excel to actually calculate these different diversity measures that Nicholas has just gone through. So next slide. So if you're not familiar, data.census.gov is the platform that we have for releasing data. This is kind of the easiest way for you to access the redistricting files. When you go to data.census.gov, the very first kind of window you have lets you put in different table numbers. You can also put in certain keywords if you're searching for a specific item like age or sex. Also, you can put in like a data set. Here we can just, the easiest thing is put in P2. And this is referencing the table P2 from the redistricting file, which includes Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race. So after we put in P2, we hit enter, or we hit that little search, and then it's going to come up and there's two options, and we select Hispanic or Latino and not Hispanic or Latino by race. Next slide. So after we've selected table P2, what we want to do is customize the table so we can select the geographies. And this example that I'm going to give today, we're going to select data for all counties in the United States, and then calculate the different diversity measures for all counties. So we hit Customize Table. Then the next thing that we do is we go to the Geos tab. Well, it's not a tab, I guess, but this little Geos feature. This allows you to select all the different geographic levels that we have available for the census data. You can have for the nation, you have states, you have counties. You also can get down to block groups, to places, to MSAs. So there's a lot there. Step 5, we select the geographic level. And again, in this example, we're looking at all counties. So once you select counties, it comes up with an option. You can select all counties within a specific geography. For instance, you could select all counties just within Maryland if you want it to be easier. And once you've selected once you've made your selection, you hit close, and then you'll get this message. Don't worry, it says the table is too large to display. That's because in this example we have, it'd be over 3,000 columns, and that is a large table. So it says the table is too large to display, but just go ahead and hit download the table. Okay, after you do that, a window will appear with some pre-selected items. You don't need to change anything. You could at this point add like the 2010 data if you're interested in that. But for our example, we'll just select download, After we do that, a pop-up window will appear, and there we just hit download now in the pop-up window. So the files will be zipped. There's a data file, there's a metadata file, and then some other information. So you get several files with the download. They'll be zipped, and so you'll need to use an application such as WinZip or something else to open them. Once they come up, you'll want to open the file that has _ data in the file name, and this is the actual data file. Okay, so now we're going to transition and talk about Microsoft Excel and how you can calculate the different diversity measures. So the screenshot here shows what the data are going to look like when they come into Excel. We want to prepare the data. So first thing is we only need to keep certain variables. We're keeping the GeoID in case you want to do any mapping or any other kind of merging on with other data. We're going to keep the name of the geography. We're going to keep variable P2 _ 001N. That's the total population. We're going to keep variable P2 _ 002N, which is the Hispanic or Latino population. And then we're going to keep these next variables, P2 005N through P2 0011N. And these are all the different non-Hispanic race and ethnic groups. And as Nicholas explained earlier in his presentation, his part of the presentation, we cross Hispanic origin by race because we need to have mutually exclusive groups in order to calculate these diversity measures. So once you've deleted those variables that you don't need, and I'd encourage you just to delete the ones you don't need, you can also delete that second row. Okay. So our first step is going to be to, well, I've made a lot of steps, I guess, but our next step is going to be to calculate race and ethnicity proportions. And this is really important that we use proportions here and not percentages. If we use percentages, then the equation for calculating the diversity index will not work. So we calculate the proportions. So for Hispanic or Latino, we would calculate that variable P2002N, which is the Hispanic or Latino population, and we divide that by the total population for the county. And in Excel, if you are doing the same, approach, it'd be the cell 2 equals cell D2 divided by cell C2. And in the equation, I'm sure people know a lot of, probably more than me even, about Excel, so I won't go into a lot of details, but if we use the $, it makes it an absolute reference, and so if we copy it across, that's not going to change. And because we're doing proportions, we want that denominator, which is the total population, we want that to be consistent across all the different race ethnicity groups. So that's why we have that $. There. So we can go ahead and we can do the proportion for all of the different race and ethnicity groups. So for white alone, non-Hispanic, for black alone, non-Hispanic, American Indian and Alaska Native, or AIN, alone, non-Hispanic. Next slide. And then we also have Asian alone, non-Hispanic, Native Hawaiian and other Pacific Islander alone, non-Hispanic, or NHPI. We have our some other race category, alone, non-Hispanic, so this is SOR. And then 2 or more races, or the multiracial population, non-Hispanic. And John, if you could add those title names to the chat, that way people have those. And then after you've calculated that for that first line, you can click and drag the equation. You can double click on that little box in the corner of the cell, and it'll copy it down to all of the counties. Again, I know that you guys probably use Excel quite a bit, so I'll try not to get too in the weeds on that. Next slide. So now we're ready to calculate our diversity index. Again, we have to have proportions, so that's why we didn't calculate these by 100, but we have the proportion Hispanic or Latino, the proportion white alone, non-Hispanic. One check you could do here is you could sum all the different proportions to make sure that they equal 1, and they should. And that way you'll know you have all of the right groups accounted for. So the diversity index, this is a measure that we have we've chosen to use when talking about 2020 census data. There's several measures, but this is one of the first ones that we thought of because it is a kind of a cool way of summarizing data. You can see a lot of information just in that one score. And what it tells us is the probability that 2 people chosen at random will be from different race and ethnicity groups. And that's in a specific geography. So here we're looking at county diversity index. So the diversity index is calculated as 1 minus each of the different proportion groups, so each of the different proportion of the race groups squared, summed together. So we have 1 minus Hispanic squared plus white squared plus black squared plus AIN squared and on to, to have multiracial squared. And then here's the example, and thanks John for posting that. In our example, here's the formula that you'd use to calculate the diversity index. So again, the diversity index tells us the proportion, or sorry, not proportion, the probability that 2 people chosen at random will be from different race and ethnic groups. Can you go to the next slide, Nicholas? So for all the things that we've released and that we've put in our blogs and in the data visualizations, we actually don't show the probability, we show the chance. What's the percentage chance of 2 people being chosen at random? So that's easy to calculate. Once we have our diversity index, we just multiply that by 100, and that'll get us the percent chance. So what's the chance that 2 people chosen at random will be from different race or ethnic groups? And we find that that's easier for people to kind of interpret or to make sense of than saying the probability, a 0.5 probability versus a 50% chance. Okay, next slide. So I've talked through how we can do the diversity index in Excel. Now I'll talk about the prevalence rankings. So we can calculate the most prevalent race or ethnicity groups using the large function in Excel. So this function, it returns whichever, so it looks at an array of numbers and it gives you whichever value you specify. So it looks at the ranked values. So to calculate that first prevalent group, we put in this equation large, and then we have the array, so L2 through S2, and that's all of our different proportions that we use for the diversity index. And then we want to specify, we want the largest one. So L2 through S2 and then comma 1. So that returns that largest group, which for this first county that we see here, that was 0.70. We're going to make that into a percent, just so it's a little easier to interpret. So we times that by 100. Another thing we do when we do the prevalence rankings, which is important, is we check for ties. There are instances where a county has more than one race group. They have 2 or more race groups that end up having the same value. And so it creates ties in the data. And because we're using rankings and ranked data, we want to account for that. For our data visualizations and for other statistics we released from the 2020 census, when we had ties in counties, we excluded those because we didn't want to have to come up with any kind of sort of arbitrary approach for selecting one race or ethnicity group over another. Just if they were tied, we just took those out. So the way we identify ties, there's a function in Excel, it's called COUNTIF. And so what we do is we're going to specify the range, and we're going to give it, that comma here, the example, first ties COUNTIF L2 through S2. So it's going to look through that array. If it sees this value, which is the first most prevalent, then it's going to count it. If it sees it more than once, then it can count. 1 would be if it's only there once, 2 or more would be if it's there more than once, it's tied. And then finally, our first label. I won't go into a lot of detail on this formula, but what we're saying is if there's not a tie, then give us the column heading for that value. So we have to specify that first prevalent group, which is the V2 in the equation. And if there is a tie, then it'll say tie. And so for this example here, we see it says white alone, because that was the largest race or ethnic group, and it wasn't tied. Okay, that's a lot of information there, especially a lot of Excel stuff, but you'll have these slides, you'll be able to kind of copy the equations here and to go through. We repeat the same process to calculate the second and third most prevalent race or ethnicity groups. And again, we still want to check for ties. That's important. There's subtle differences here. For the second most prevalent group, we again use that large function, but we specify, after we specify the array, we tell it we want the second highest value, which is the comma 2. That red arrow kind of got shifted. It should be over the 2. And then we do, the rest of it's the same. You just want to make sure that when you're doing the count if function, that you're specifying that it's the second prevalent proportion, and then also in your label, you want to specify that's the second prevalent proportion. So that's that Z2 value here. Okay, and then for the third most prevalent group, it's just the same. We just want to make sure that we're referencing that third prevalent proportion. Okay, now finally we can talk about how we can create the diffusion score. So again, the diffusion score tells us the percentage of the population that is not in the 3 most prevalent groups. So it's an indicator of how unconcentrated or how diffuse the population is among the different race and ethnicity groups. So it's fairly easy to calculate now that we have our our most prevalent percent groups. So we just subtract those from 100. So the value would be 100 minus that first prevalent percent plus the second prevalent percent and then the third prevalent percent. So that's how we get our diffusion score. So we've tried to make these examples pretty simple. When we produce the data for the data visualizations and for the reports and everything that we didn't actually use Excel. We use SAS because that's mostly what the programming language that we use in our part of the Census Bureau. But we did want to make something that would be accessible to data users. This is the first time we've kind of demoed this. So any feedback you have would be great. And you have our emails here that you can send it. Also, any questions you have. I'm not an Excel expert, but I can do these calculations and I can talk through them if you have questions. So with that, Nicholas and I are open for questions about every part of our presentation.
Thank you, Nicholas and Eric. It was a good presentation, very informative, and I especially liked about how you guys showed the calculation of the diversity index and the scores. And we have in the past shown the composition of minorities at county jurisdictions. Maybe this is something we will switch to when we do analysis and reporting of the minority composition. So we have a couple of questions here. I will let you choose between the two of you who would answer this, I guess. This is a question from Sean Kimberly. Says, while the classification system for the 2010 and 2020 censuses all adhere to the 1997 standards for the classification of federal data on race and ethnicity from the Office of Management and Budget, it can be difficult to determine how much of an observed change is due to one or more of the following factors. The first factor being actual change in the racial ethnic composition of the population. 2, change over time in how people self-identify when it comes to race or ethnicity. 3, changes in Census Bureau's processing, interpretation, and coding of the responses and non-responses in 2020. Do you have any thoughts, advice on the best way to interpret and report on reported differences between censuses, given the variety of factors that may be contributing to an observed change? I'm sorry if you guys got that whole question. I can
No,
repeat.
great, Al. That's actually a great question to start with. What I would encourage all of the audience and your colleagues to read is our America Counts story that highlights those important changes that we've made. The reason I wanted to start everyone with the first America Counts story on how we measured racial and ethnicity concepts and calculated the data in 2020 is that there are a wealth of links and resources within that America Counts story that will point you into all of the weeds that you would really like to understand. So from that question that was just posed, we have references to the actual ways in which we improved our coding system. We have references to a webinar and a blog that was done pre-release of the results on August 12th that talk about the changes that we made and why we made those changes to improve the accuracy of the data that we're collecting. There's also a link to a really neat data visualization on measuring racial and ethnic categories in the decennial census, from the first census in 1790 to the most recent census in 2020. One thing that you'll learn from that particular infographic, as well as the story and the data that's related to it, is that the ways in which we've collected these data over the centuries have changed every census from 1790 to the present, often reflecting the changes in our nation's social, economic, political factors and influences. And that's no different between 2010 and 2020. I do want to reassure you that we know that we've made improvements from census to census in how we're measuring and calculating and communicating these concepts. And that's what's really important for the results from 2020. They're a new snapshot, they're a new measure, they're more accurate, they're more detailed, and they're more complex. And you really need to understand all of that as you think about what I'm comparing from the present to the past. Finally, what I'll say is that, as Eric and I discussed today, the measures of racial and ethnic diversity are something that we see as very comparable because we use the same measures in 2010 and in 2020 using mutually exclusive groups from that table P2 in the redistricting file. Many of the changes that we saw in the racial and ethnic composition of the country overall are really due to the ways in which Hispanic respondents have reported their identities in response to the separate questions on race and ethnicity. And that's a big driving factor in why the Census Bureau recommended that we move forward with a combined race ethnicity question. It gives us better measures of the ways in which people are self-identifying here in the 21st century, their race and or their ethnicity. So that's a lot, but I want to encourage people again to start with that America Counts story and then look at all the references that help them go further and understand these results.
Thank you, Nicholas. That was a detailed explanation, and we will follow through on reading the American Counts story. I have another question here from Jesse Ash. Any thoughts on how much of the increase in persons of some other race and two or more races may be due to an actual increase in those populations and a change in respondent identification?
Thanks. That's another question. It's very related to the detailed answer that I provided, so I'm not going to go into as much detail. But again, that America Counts story talks about the ways in which we've looked at the changes in Hispanic racial identification. There's a graphic within the story which shows that many Hispanics in 2010 may have self-identified as white alone, or identified as or identified as some other race alone. In 2020, what we saw is that many Hispanic respondents are now identifying as some other race alone or the combination of white and some other race. What we know about the some other race population, because we're following the OMB standards to classify all of these groups, if someone's able to respond to the question on race by telling us something about their detailed identity, maybe they're telling us that they're German, or that they're Jamaican, or that they're Japanese, those are what we call write-ins. They've written in information about their identity, and we use the OMB standards to code and classify those responses. We didn't get into great detail about those classification systems, but again, that's something that's in our America Counts stories for you to read and understand. In a nutshell, all Hispanic responses to the question on race, such as Mexican or Salvadoran or Latino or Peruvian, they're classified as the category some other race because Hispanic responses may be of any race. What that means is that we don't take a response of Salvadoran and code it as Black. We don't take a response of Peruvian and code it as American Indian, or a response of Mexican and code it as white. they're remaining in that sum of the race category, whereas other responses that are non-Hispanic in nature, German, Jamaican, Japanese, they're identified within the OMB standards as being a specific race group. So German is a European response, which is then coded as white. Jamaican is a Black response. Japanese is an Asian response. So the overwhelming majority of the sum of the race population is people who report that their race is their Hispanic origin. And that's been true for the last several censuses. What we predicted in our research is that sum of the race would likely be the second largest race group in 2020 if we stayed with the separate question design. And that's in fact what happened. It's intended to be a residual category, but we know that the category is representative of Hispanics who would like to say that their race is Hispanic.
Thank you, Nicholas. I have one final question here. This is probably more maybe Eric or you can answer. So like the example we saw where the diversity index was calculated was probably shown at the county geography. Would that be applicable if we calculate the diversity index at a smaller geography like a neighborhood? Because like with race data, we have the data available at the block level. And again, like we were advised not to use block level data, I guess, or use it with a grain of salt with the differential privacy being in effect. So any thoughts on what is recommended by you folks, the level of geography where this can be applied and used meaningfully?
Yeah, so I've been looking at it at other levels of geography, tracks and places. I would sort of tell people to be a little cautious if there's small populations. One thing about the diversity index is it doesn't take into account the number of groups. There are there's other indexes, for instance, like the Shannon Evenness Index or the Entropy Index, and that has a part of the equation that takes account of the number of groups. And like we said, diversity is maximized when all groups are represented and they have equal shares of the population. With the diversity index, you might have in those smaller geographies, you might have a lot of the groups are not there, that there's zero population. And so that's just something to keep in mind. The interpretation would be the same. It's the probability that two people chosen at random from that census tract are from different race ethnicity groups. So you should be able to still calculate it. Like I said, when I calculate it for places, I'll look at what's the total population for that place. And that's kind of a good guide, because if there's a really high or really low diversity index, but it's a small population, maybe that's not the best metric for that place. And so then I might look at what's the most prevalent group. Is the most prevalent group the same as like for the county, or is it different? And so you can do some analyses like that.
All right. And as one of the previous questions that was asked, like we provide some technical feedback on the data when we are reviewing comp plans, and I was asking this specifically if we were to look at a smaller municipality with a fewer population, say about 500 or so, that kind of a thing is why we asked this question. Thank you, Eric. Thanks for answering. We'll keep that in perspective. And I'm sorry, I have one other question. This probably would be the last question, I guess. This is from Beth. She's asking if a person selected Hispanic or Latino and then selected white and wrote in Cuban, would they have been coded as white or as some other race?
Great, and thank you for that question. So one thing that I'll encourage anyone who's interested in really learning about the detailed ways in which we code and classify the data is to check out our webinar, which was released. Again, you can find it on our census.gov website in the redistricting toolkit. And in that webinar, we talked about specific types of reporting examples. So within the two separate questions format, if someone were to report in the Hispanic origin question that they were Hispanic, there's also a checkbox there labeled Cuban. So in this example, I'm guessing the person probably said in the Hispanic origin question that they were Cuban. And then in answering the separate question on race, if they were to check a box that's labeled white, or check a box labeled Black, or check a box labeled American Indian, that checkbox remains. For the first time in 2020 census, in decennial census history, rather, we had write-in areas, which are dedicated areas associated with checkboxes that collect more detailed information. So for the very first time, there was a dedicated write-in area for the white racial category and also a dedicated write-in area for the Black or African American racial category. So depending on where that person wrote in the response of Cuban, if there was an associated checkbox with it, that would determine how it's classified. If they checked white and wrote in Cuban, they would be classified as white and some other race. And it doesn't matter where they wrote Cuban in. We recognize that as a dedicated response that they've told us, and that they also checked that associated box or another box. They may have checked Black or African American. We respected all of the ways in which respondents self-identified. So we don't make the determination that because you checked something and wrote in another response that may be perhaps not in that classification system, we still respect the fact that you told us both things. And that's true in 2010 as well as in 2020. What's really different and more complex about the work that we've done in 2020 is that we've collected more information than ever before. We moved from 30 character recognition to 200 character recognition. We also moved from coding only 2 responses per write-in line to up to 6 per write-in line. And that's to account for the 6 categories that are in the racial and ethnic classification system that we use. So we found more detail, more information, and more accuracy with how we've collected and coded these data for 2020. And that also has impacts on the results that we're seeing. Again, more accurate results of how people are self-identifying with these 2 separate questions.
Right. Thank you, Nicholas. And this is our last question for the presenters. Thank you, Nicholas and Eric. Very nice presentation and very informative. And with that, we will go to the final presentation of the webinar, which is on upcoming census programs. So I'm going to bring up my screen here and turn it into full screen. All right, I think we're good to go. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the data that was released by the Census Bureau for the 2020 census and show some trends about what's going on. And actually, I want to focus more on the 2 upcoming programs that we would be heavily involved with. One is the census count question resolution. That's about how you can challenge a census count and see if there are errors that's a way or a means to get it corrected. And the last one I want to go over is the PUMA program, or the PUMA delineation. This is about census geographies which have about 100,000 people and have some detailed information. Those are the 2 programs I would like to go over. So with that said, let's go into what I have here with this 2020 census data. So this chart, basically, again, like this information has been available for quite some time, but just to keep things in perspective, this is population data for Maryland from 1950 to 2020. This is the actual census data for each decade from 1950 to 2020. And as you can see, roughly from 1960 to 2020, the population in Maryland almost doubled. It's like we are a growing state, and I think, in fact, Maryland is one of the fastest growing state in the Northeast. Let's go to the next slide here. And this shows the housing units, again, from 1950 to 2020. If you see the chart here, and from 1950 census to 1970, the housing units in Maryland almost doubled. And from 1970 to 2020, again, they doubled, but again, that's over a 50-year period. This is kind of in line with the household size. The average household size in 1950s was much higher than in 2020. So that's why we have a lot more housing units in 2020 compared to what we had earlier, where we had higher household sizes. Again, like this cannot directly be related to housing units with the population, because the population numbers we were showing were for total population, not the household population. But again, it just keeps things in perspective about the increase in housing units. This chart shows the 2020 population for the Maryland's jurisdictions. And as most of you are aware, Montgomery County has by far the highest population. There are over 1 million people there, and Prince George's County is close to 1 million. And some of the smallest counties are on the eastern shore of Maryland and western Maryland. You have your Kent County, Garrett County, Somerset on the eastern shore. Actually, Garrett County is on western Maryland. So this gives you an idea of the population. And one thing I wanted to point out here is also like, this is the first time Anne Arundel County has increased by, is more than Baltimore City. This hasn't happened in the past. And this is the first, this census actually shows an increase for Anne Arundel County compared to Baltimore City's population, I'm sorry. And this is the change in population by jurisdiction from 2010 to 2020. Prince George's County had by far the highest increase, about 103,000 people. And one thing I wanted to point out here is, basically when we were looking at the census estimates data, the Prince George's County's population was always shown a little lower than what the census number came out as. But again, like I have my own questioning, I guess, like whereas Washington DC's estimates population number was much higher than the actual census count. Maybe the way people were identified was a little different, and the census estimates versus the actual census where you have the actual data. So that might be one of the factors. A couple of other things I wanted to point out. Baltimore City had a decline of about a little over 35,000 population from 2010 to 2020. And yeah, Allegheny County, that was a kind of a surprise. In Western Maryland, lost almost close to 7,000 people compared to 2010 to 2020. And we have a few other counties on the eastern shore that have lost population, but most of the growth that occurred in Maryland is in your big suburban counties, like Anne Arundel, Baltimore County, and Howard counties. So that's that. And these are the housing units, as you can probably relate to when we saw the population data. This shows the 2020 housing units. Montgomery County has by far the largest number of housing units, and this is kind of in line with the population data. The only thing I wanted to point out is Baltimore City has a lot more housing units than Anne Arundel County, and it has a little less population, Baltimore City, compared to Anne Arundel County. So maybe there might be a few more vacant housing units in Baltimore City. This chart shows the change in housing units from 2010 to 2020. And in line with the population growth, Prince George's County has the highest increase in housing units, followed by Montgomery County. And Anne Arundel County surprisingly had about 20,000 more housing units. And at the bottom of the chart, we see Baltimore City has lost a few housing units compared to what they had in 2010. And they lost a lot more people though. So let's go to, so that's just a quick overview of some of the data that was released by the Census Bureau, which we kind of took a look at. I didn't want to spend too much time on the data which you all had access to for the last couple of months, but I want to go into a more interesting topic, the census count questions resolution, and give you an overview of what it is and how you can challenge the census count questions and how you can rectify them. So with that said, and again, like I don't want to blame anybody here. In most cases, when you're counting population data or anything, it cannot be 100% accurate. There might be some errors, and those errors are something that could be rectified in ways. With regards to the census, there might be boundary errors, like with the boundary lines not showing accurately where the municipality is located. It might be due to when the BAS or the boundary annexation survey information is submitted or been accepted by the Census Bureau. If that's an issue, the Census Bureau will correct the boundary error and update the total population for the particular municipality, either increasing it or decreasing it, I guess, based on how the boundary is drawn. And in some cases, we might have geolocation errors where address points are misassigned to the wrong blocks. This might be due to geocoding errors. If there's a glaring error, this could be pointed out with supporting documentation, and the Census Bureau would consider making a change. And the last thing is the coverage of residential addresses or GQs. If a particular GQ in a particular area has information hasn't been reported accurately in the census release, this could be the particular county or jurisdiction could challenge the count by submitting supporting data for the GQs or residential addresses that were missed, and the Census Bureau will consider them and update the totals. I will go into a little bit of what the process is to do this in the later slides. So, and these are some issues that are usually with the data, and these cannot be challenged. Like, for example, if the Census Bureau doesn't receive responses from a particular household or a geography, they might impute the data using administrative records. And if that's the case, there might be an undercount, overcount based on what information is being used. So if that's the case and you find an error, that particular instance cannot be challenged according to the census count question resolution. And respondent errors, if somebody doesn't fill their forms right, again, like that's a user error. At a residential housing unit level, it might not be a big issue, but if it's at a group quarters and the manager of the group quarters fails to submit the census form, that might lead to an issue of undercount. So that's again, like user errors cannot typically be challenged. Final thing, this might be a very slight thing, a minor thing, like the DAS, which we heard about earlier. If it changes the population at the census block geography, which could be very minimal, it would not be accurate. But again, like those sorts of things are in place to keep the data confidential, and those cannot be challenged as well. So things that can be challenged or cannot be challenged is what I went over. And I'm going to give a quick overview of the process of how the CQR happens, CQR being the count question resolution. And this is some information that was provided by Matthew Freites. He's with the Census Bureau, and I've been using this information. So after the census data is published, it's up to the local governments, in Maryland's case, state and local governments, to review the census results. And if there's a mismatch in housing units or population, or actually not population, the boundary errors, they may file a CQR case. And once the case is submitted to the Census Bureau, they review the materials and correctness and completeness, and whether that particular case is within the scope. Like in a couple of slides before, I mentioned what is considered to be a part of CQR and what isn't. So if it is within the scope, the Census Bureau will process that based on the data that's submitted along with the justifications. If there are processing errors, the Census Bureau will pass that information to be corrected, and they will respond to the highest elected official of the jurisdiction that submitted the CQR case with their determination, and any revisions are posted as errata on the 2020 CQR website. And if there are no processing errors, the case is closed and nothing happens. So with that said, so okay, again, like this is what happens after the errata notices are issued. These will be issued by September 30th, 2023. And again, like this is information that I found out based on the draft or federal guidelines that were posted on the Federal Register notice back in August. And they were in comment period till about last week. And in the next couple of weeks also, they might release the final guidelines for the count question resolution. And one other thing I wanted to note is like any corrections that are made as a part of the CQR would not change the redistricting information, or that file, the PL data is not going to be changed. No changes are going to be made for the apportionment, and the only changes that probably would be made, or not probably, that will be made are for the census estimates base total for the geography. And this is helpful because like the census estimates is released every year, and it's in a way tied into the federal funding that's allocated based on population. So that's that. And this is a screenshot of the census block viewer, and I have a link there listed there. That's the second link, so boundaries the census boundaries of any state. The census address count listing viewer. I'm sorry, that's the third link. So if you use that link and click on any geography, it will tell you the number of housing units are in each block, and also if there are any group quotas listed in that block. This could be helpful in making the determination for a CQR case. And we have also some other additional information posted on our website, like on the State Data Center website. We have posted the redistricting data that's released at the smallest geography, the block level. That could be helpful in assessing the data. And the second link shows the census Tiger Line web files, where you can access the geography shapefiles to join them with the data to look at the data spatially. So we have some quick some examples of what you might see. This picture shows when we got the census data, we looked at it at the block level for a couple of counties for an analysis we were doing internally for our growth model. And this kind of showed us, this is the 2020 census data. And we compared this data with the Department of Assessments data, where they send the tax bills to all the housing units and all the buildings. So that data shows like we have about 32 more units, residential units. Looks like these are townhouses here in that particular geography. Again, like this, for a particular small geography, this might not be worthwhile looking at considering a CQR case, but these are some of the issues you might find. If there's a bigger error or bigger mismatch, then that might be worth considering a CQR case. And in this case, this shows a fairly new development. And again, like based on our comparison with this latest data from SDAT, there are about 26 more housing units. But most of it is new construction. And one of the guidelines says that any new construction after 2020 January should not be considered as a part of CQR. So if it's fairly new, it's probably not worthwhile using that as a part of your supporting documentation for your CQR case. Another example here shows a multifamily or apartment type of structures. Again, like this fairly new lot of new construction, and in this block, I don't know if you can see my pointer. There's an apartment building which lists, according to the Census Bureau, that particular block has about 175 housing units. But according to our investigation using the other data sources we have, basically the SDAT and CAMA data, we thought it says like there are 290 units. And if this is a bigger number, this is something that could be used to submit as a ways to challenge the count of the housing units. So that's an example. And finally, quickly, like if this is mostly for the local governments, if you are considering a CQR challenge, we will work with you. We will provide technical assistance, training, and provide supporting data we have, like the tax parcel information, which we have on our websites. And we'll also have a kickoff announcement when the final guidelines are released, and we will reach out to all the local governments that have participated in LUCA. And we are anticipating on having a CQR workshop sometime in December and January, because this program officially kicks off sometime in January 2022. So that's that. And I have one other program to go over, and I'll probably take questions after I'm done with that. So this is the final thing I'm going to talk about. This is the upcoming program as well. The PUMS are the public use microdata areas. The PUMAs are what needs to be delineated after every census. The PUMAs are geographies that have at least 100,000 people. And let me just tell you a little bit about the PUMS files. The PUMS files are microdata sample files which have information on individual people and housing units. It has various socioeconomic data that's used to put together the ACS data files. And one thing to note, the PUMS files that are going to be released in the future are also subject to differential privacy or TAS. One quick example of the use of this PUMS data, we sometimes get a request, or we actually usually annually get a request from our Department of Aging, where they want to look at specific information which is not available through ACS. They want to look at people who are over 60 years in Maryland that have a disability and have an income less than 30,000 or so. So when we are using 3 different variables to find out data, we have to go to the PUMPS data, which has the microsample data to put that together. So that's a good use of PUMPS data. And PUMPS geographies. Quickly, the PUMPS data is available for the whole country, the US regions, divisions, states, and the PUMAs. The PUMAs are what we are in the process of delineating. PUMAs are geographies within the state that have at least 100,000 people. The PUMAs can cross county boundaries because they need to meet a population threshold of 100,000. And in some cases where the county has more than 100,000 or more than 200,000 people, they would have at least 2 PUMAs. So that's in the guidelines as well. And this is a quick schedule of the PUMA delineating process. In summer, the criteria was summer of 2021. The criteria were posted on the census webpage. Towards the end of September, so the Census Bureau sent notifications to the State Data Center, officially announcing the program and announcing the training conferences that are going to be in place. Again, like I mentioned, there are 2 more training conferences, workshops that are going to happen, one on October 27th and the last one on December 15th. So that's if there's any interest, we will provide information to access those trainings as well. From November 2021 to January 22, that's a 90-day period for the state data centers to delineate and submit the PUMAs to the Census Bureau. And in summer of 2022, the final PUMAs and their associated data will probably be available online. Again, that last sentence is subject to change based on the other criteria of when the data is going to be released. This is a quick illustration of the 2010 census data and the 2020 census data for Maryland jurisdictions on the left. The table on the left shows the population for the jurisdictions in Maryland. The jurisdictions in red are the ones that lost population or had lower population in 2020 compared to 2010. And the table on the right shows the 2020 population and the 2010 census population. And also the 4th column identifies the number of PUMAs we had back in 2010 for each jurisdiction. And the 5th column, the potential 2020 PUMA count, is just a rough estimation of how many PUMAs a particular county might have based on the population threshold. And the last set of columns show how many counties or jurisdictions would have single PUMAs or multi-PUMAs and would be a part of a PUMA. So this is information could be used when the PUMA delineations are going to be done. Now, one thing I'm going to add is we are going to be reaching out to all the local jurisdictions, jurisdictions being here, the counties. If they are interested in participating in the PUMA delineation, we will work with them and delegate that particular work to the county for counties that have population threshold of at least 200,000 or more, because like they would need to split the county into at least 2 PUMAs. But for smaller jurisdictions, we will try to put together PUMAs for where we have to combine counties. As we have done in the past, and we'll try to be consistent or leave the same PUMA boundaries as they were in the past if they meet the population threshold. If they do not meet the population threshold because of population loss, we will coordinate with the counties before we finalize any PUMA delineation boundaries. And this is some information on an upcoming PUMA workshop, which the State Data Center is going to hold. We have a workshop scheduled tentatively for November 5th. And at that workshop, we will go over the guidelines to delineate PUMAs. We will give an overview of the Census Bureau software, the GUP software that's going to be used to delineate the PUMAs. And we will again go over the schedule of when these will be done and submitted to the Census Bureau. And we will provide technical assistance as needed to individuals who are working on this particular project. So that's it. And our point person for this particular project is Jesse Ash. He's a senior planner in the State Data Center. He will be coordinating with the local governments to run this program. And you have my contact information as well. That said, I'll be happy to take any questions if there are any. I think I have a question that was submitted through chat. Let me see if I can get that up here. Okay. Let me read the question. Just give me a moment. I'm trying to. Okay. So there was a question on, are there any plans for training on additional census platforms? Again, like we will provide training if we get any requests from any local governments or any affiliates of the State Data Center. So I did mention about the dates for the upcoming GUPS training for Puma delineation. They are October 27th and December 15th. We will send a link for anybody who's interested. Please contact us. And this is a different question, I guess. This is actually related to our projections. How close were the 2020 projections to the actual census counts? Okay, our projections were a little under the actual census number. We were about 1.7% lower than the actual census number. And again, like we base mostly our census, our projections using the estimates data as a base. For 2015 was used as a base. And when we, again, like it was mentioned like the census estimate number was about 2% or so lower for the state. And we were a lot, considerably, maybe about 3 or 4% under for Prince George's County. And we were a little over for Allegheny County, which showed a decline in population. So those are the types of things which kind of threw us off. But yeah, we will look at the data from now on and use the 2020 as a base as we develop our projections in the future. So that is the last question for us. Let me see if there are any other questions. I don't see any other questions. So again, like this concludes our annual meeting and workshop. Before that, I would like to offer a big thank you to Secretary McCord for sharing his words, Noemi Mendes, Michael Haas, Nicholas Jones, and Eric Jensen from the Census Bureau. And I would also like to thank Krishna Kundi for coordinating the logistics of this meeting. And finally, John Coleman, our communications and tech guru, for making sure that everything runs smoothly. And thank you for all of you that attended. And finally, the complete recording of today's webinar will be posted on the State Data Center's website next week. We will post all the presentations along with contact information of our speakers. Thank you and have a great day.